Time is 6 o'clock and welcome to the BBC's special election coverage with me here in London and with Kirsty Wark in Edinburgh. We are taking you through the evening, right until 10 o'clock, because we've got lots of results coming in on the Scottish Parliament, the Welsh Senedd, the Welsh Parliament, and lots of local authorities in England. 4,500 council seats being elected, 143 local authorities. We have mayoral contests in cities and regions, and we have police and crime commissioners. Honestly, it's a bumper course of results for you. So stay with us and we'll bring you right up to date. It was a really bad start to the day for Labour, it has to be said, because they lost the Hartlepool by-election. There was a stunning Conservative win there. It had been a safe Labour seat since the 1960s, but not anymore. It now has a Conservative majority of nearly 7,000 votes. Jill Mortimer winning there, and the Labour leader Keir Starmer saying it was bitterly disappointing.
Well, here at Holyrood, we've had a steady stream of results in what is the most important election in Scotland since devolution. The SNP have so far gained the constituency of Ayr from the Conservatives, but Nicola Sturgeon's Scottish National Party is not having it all its own way, and there is some evidence of tactical voting against her. It's certainly too early to say if she's going to get the overall majority she needs, if she's going to claim a mandate for a second referendum on independence.
Well, we're keeping an eye on all of the mayoral contests going on around England, where Labour have won in Liverpool. The Conservatives have chalked up a huge majority in Tees Valley. And Rita's with me to keep an eye on all the results, including Wales.
And the story in Wales so far is of a significantly better performance for Labour than in England. For example, in Gower, where they held off a Tory attack and increased their majority. 12 results in from Wales out of a total of 60, many more still to come.
Well, the next few hours could be decisive, not only just in Scotland. So John Curtis is crunching all the numbers, and we think we are edging ever closer to being able to say who has won. So join us for all the political twists and turns of election 2021.
Yes, indeed. And if you're just joining us after hours of coverage, you're joining us actually at the very best minute, because we are now about to have a rush of results from now to 10 o'clock this evening. We won't get them all. They'll go into tomorrow, lots of them, but we'll have a good idea by 10 o'clock tonight. And Kirsty, for you so far in Scotland, which is such a pivotal election at this time, with the future of the Union, being questioned, what's been so far for you the most notable set of results? Which ones would you pick out for those viewers just joining us?
I would certainly say that in terms of the SNP targets, obviously Ayr is a critical one, and also East Lothian. Now, these are two of the victories they needed because they're in the SNP's top targets. But as our political correspondent Nick Earley completely reminds us time and again, is not over till it's over, because all the impact of that and what the SNP does in the constituencies is offset by what might happen in the list. What is quite clear, I think, is that Nicola Sturgeon will go forward. She may not reach her 65, the magical number she would need to win outright, but she will be in the winning camp, as it were, because she will probably have the Greens there with her, who will provide the overall majority that she needs and that she will say is a mandate to call for a second independence referendum. The key thing in Scotland at the moment is, yet again, it's an exciting story in Scotland, and the Constitution, which has really dominated Scottish politics for the last 20-odd years, continues to dominate. That tussle between Scotland and Downing Street is only going to get much more visceral as we have a Conservative leader, a Conservative Prime Minister, who will push back at every turn on the legitimacy of granting a second independence referendum. That is what is so fascinating, because it comes down to an argument about what constitutes consent by the voters. If the voters do not consent to be part of the UK and consent to having an independence referendum, can Boris Johnson hold the UK together under the force of the law and nothing else? That is one of the most fascinating conundrums, or conundra, that we face in Scotland. And that is going to unravel, I think, tonight.
Interesting again, Kirsty. So lots to think about going forward. And of course, we're keeping very close tabs on what's going on in the English local elections. And of course, yes, Kirsty.
So what I was going to say about that was, we were talking about, the Red Wall in the north, but then when you look at Basildon and you look at potentially what's happening in Liverpool, Labour's not just taking a hit along the Red Wall, Labour's taking a hit in other areas of England.
Indeed, and that's something I wanted to pick up with Sir John Curtis, and I think that John is with us. So let's say welcome to John once again. John, can I just do 3 sections with you, because I like setting you a bit of a challenge. You normally rise to the challenge very well. So basically a summary of where we are with Scotland, a summary of where we are with the English local authority so far, and a summary of where we are with Wales. Let's go.
Let's go. Right. OK, in Scotland, we have so far, across all the constituencies, seen the narrowest of swings to the SNP, of the order of 1% from the Conservatives and about 0.5% from Labour. That, if it were to be replicated in each and every constituency, would not be sufficient to get the SNP to the 65 mark. However, it doesn't need to be much more than that before they might get past the 65 mark. And we've already seen how the SNP have managed to pick up 2 of the crucial 9 constituencies, 6 of which they need to get to the 65 mark during the course of today. So I think, the SNP are not doing as well as some of the more optimistic forecasts for them before yesterday, but they're still in the game. And we may well be waiting till the last vote in the last constituency or the last region sometime tomorrow before we know whether they're going to make it. In Wales, well, the interesting thing about Wales, we thought the principal thing that was going to happen in Wales was that the Labour Party always struggles a little bit in Senedd elections. It doesn't do so well as it does in Westminster elections. It doesn't get much more than 35% of the vote. And we thought the Conservatives were going to profit from the collapse of the UKIP vote in Wales, which was very substantial in 2016. Well, actually, Labour have been able to advance on their 2016 numbers. They're pretty much holding their own as compared with the 2019 general election, and the Conservatives have not actually been particularly profiting from the collapse of the UKIP vote in Wales. So as a result, Mark Drakeford, well, I'm not sure he's going to get the 31 seats he'd really like, but maybe he's not going to be in a much worse position than the 29 that he got back in 2016. Which brings us to England. Well, we've so far said that the incumbent government in Scotland is doing pretty well. The incumbent government in Wales is doing pretty well, and the incumbent government in England is doing pretty well. Of course, we had the Hartlepool by-election, but more broadly, we're looking at a set of results where certainly, remember, there are 2 halves to the English local elections. One half are the places that were last contested
John,
in 2016.
bear with me for a second. I'm very sorry. I'll come back to you. Let's go to Blaenau Gwent.
Party candidate, 2,611.
2,611.
Mandy Moore, Independent, 2,376.
So this is Blaenau Gwent. This is Edinburgh in South East Wales.
Prydain Owen Griffiths, applied to Cymru, the Party of Wales, 3,588.
It's a very big slide for Plaid Cymru.
Taylor abolished the Welsh Assembly Party, 1,364.
1,364.
And Paula Gillan Yates, Welsh Liberal Democrats, put recovery first, 333.
Democratiaid Rhyddfrydol Cymru a dyfywio yw'r flaenoriaeth 333.
Therefore, I give public notice that Thomas Alan Rhys-Davies is duly elected.
So Alan Davies, who actually survived a very close contest last time with Plaid Cymru, who ran him very close, certainly this time has a very, very solid majority of 6,500 and more in Blaenau Gwent, Ebbw Vale, on a turnout of 40%. And that, again, is a huge boost to Welsh Labour. They never thought they'd lose the seat, let's be clear, and Plaid came very close last time, which surprised lots of people. But this time, Plaid are nowhere in sight, and there we have Labour on 10,200. I just want to look at the share, because you'll see what I mean by the difference. 49% to Labour, nearly half of the vote, 17 to Plaid Cymru, 12 to the Conservatives, 11 to the Independents. And then if we look at the abolish the Welsh Assembly, they mean Senedd, a Welsh Assembly party, is on 7%, which is more than that they've been getting elsewhere. Let's look at Blaenau Gwent's change. There you have it, Alan Davies putting on 9%, and that's the big difference here from last time. Plaid's excellent performance to really get close to the winning post last time has now just gone away this time, 19% down, and the Conservatives up by 6 and Independents 11. So it's a big swing of 14% from Plaid to Labour. So I'd like to bring John Curtis back in again. That actually, John, is another interesting one, because not only does it just solidify the Welsh Labour performance, it's, although there are individual circumstances in Blaenau Gwent, Plaid Cymru will be, nursing their wounds there.
They will indeed, because of course Blaenau Gwent was one of a couple of constituencies in South Wales, not the Welsh-speaking territory where Plaid usually are strongest, where they did well in 2016. And I guess that perhaps the implication we might want to draw from this is that the chances of Leanne Wood in the Rhondda of repeating her remarkable success in winning that constituency in 2016, if Blaenau Gwent is any guide at all to the willingness of voters in South Wales to vote for Plaid this time around, that's perhaps she's going to discover that she's lost her seat. So, and it's another part of a story whereby, as you can see, the Labour Party is holding its own vis-à-vis the Conservatives in terms of the overall share of the vote, which is why we're saying that Labour should at least be pretty close to where they ended up in 2016. I think, Huw, before we were interrupted by that crucial result in South Wales, we were talking about England, and I was explaining that, or reminding viewers that there were two parts to the English local elections. One part were the seats that were last contested in 2016, the elections haven't been postponed from last year, and the other half, the elections that were meant to take place this year, mostly county councils, that were fought 4 years ago. Two very different baselines. 2016, Conservative and Labour pretty close to each other. 2017, Conservatives well ahead. Well, what we're seeing is that as compared with 2016, there's a very clear swing from Labour to the Conservatives. So the Conservatives are definitely ahead in the local elections in the 2016 contest. In contrast with the 2017 battles, actually there's overall not a great deal of movement from one side to the other. But the other crucial thing to be aware of is that basically Leave Voting England, of which Hartlepool is an example, has swung to the Conservatives, whereas Remain Voting England, for the most part, has not. And this, in a sense, is a playing out of the change in the character of the support for our two principal parties that is in evidence in 2017 and 2019, when the Conservatives gained a lot of ground amongst Leave voters, losing ground amongst Remain voters, Labour, in contrast, becoming more of a pro-Remain party. So that changed electoral coalitions that support our two principal parties, evidenced by 2019, is being played out again in these elections, in a sense, because these local elections are now catching up with the changed coalitions that were already in evidence 18 months ago.
John, thank you for now. I'm just, before I let you go, because we've been telling viewers that there's lots of excitement still to come, but from your point of view, having gone through all of these seats and permutations in great detail, just give us your headlines. What are you looking for the rest of this evening? What are the main signals that you're looking for?
Well, almost inevitably, as far as Scotland is concerned, we are literally now looking for the results in individual constituencies, because this has long seemed to be the case that in the end, the outcome of the election in Scotland, whether the SNP get an overall majority, probably didn't rest on the overall share of the vote across the country as a whole, but what happened in a small number of constituencies. Of the 9 possible targets the SNP could get, there are 2 more of them to be counted this evening, Edinburgh Central and Dumbarton. Edinburgh Central, the SNP are very confident, Dumbarton perhaps an awful lot closer. So in Scotland, it's literally those 2 seats. In Wales, I think, we're looking to see whether or not Labour continue to make their relative progress, but we know nothing as yet about the list vote in Wales, and frankly, virtually nothing about it in Scotland either. And that's a big gap in our knowledge. Meanwhile, in England, actually what we're looking for is that some of the wards where we've been collecting the detailed results, we're particularly interested in getting more of the data from the southeast of England, because it does look as though that whereas the Conservatives are doing well in the very Leave areas, as I've explained earlier, the southeast of England, which is much less Leavey in its character, is proving to be more difficult for the Conservatives, and therefore, so far as us telling you at some point this evening, hopefully, what we think the so-called projected national share is, i.e. turning the English local election results into a pseudo-general election outcome. We need a bit more information as to exactly how things are doing in the southeast before we can unveil that for you. But hopefully that'll be another piece of excitement to keep everybody going until 10 o'clock in the evening.
Some great pointers, John, as ever. Thank you very much. We'll talk to you later.
And now I'm going to talk to Nick Eardley, because I think we're somehow talking about the constituencies as being the really big deal and the list as being the kind of add-on. But just to be quite clear, we're talking about 129 seats in the Scottish Parliament, of which 73 come from the constituencies and 56 come from the list. So the lists are incredibly important. Nick, you've got some intel from a couple of seats.
Yeah, so John mentioned there the two key seats we're watching out for tonight, Edinburgh Central, Dumbarton, very crucial to the SNP. But there's a few we haven't mentioned that I think are worth just bringing into the mix to have half an eye on tonight.
Yes.
One is Murray, which is the seat that Douglas Ross holds at Westminster. It's an SNP seat at the moment, held by Richard Lochhead, the Further Education Minister. The SNP are slightly nervous about that. Not clear just how close it is, but remember there was that big swing towards the Tories in the northeast already in a couple of seats, so that's worth watching. On the other side of the scale, the other side of the country, Dumfriesshire, Oliver Mundell,
David Mundell's son,
the former Scottish Secretary. There's some optimism from the SNP camp about what's going on there.
And remind me the majority, remind me the Tory majority there.
The Tory majority at the moment in Dumfriesshire is pretty healthy. Let me just grab it here. It's 1,230.
Yes, 1,230. Yeah, it's 7th on the SNP target list, but we already know they've taken 6th on the target list.
In the south of Scotland, the Conservatives have done pretty well at general elections, so it's surprising to hear that that's considered sort of in the mix. Finally, we've got Eastwood, which is a curious seat because it's been a three-way marginal over the years. It was Labour for a while. They lost it last time in part. It was seen as because of the anti-Semitism row. There's a big Jewish population there. Currently held by the former Conservative leader in Scotland, Jackson Carlaw. Tories are a bit nervous there.
Interesting. But let's just take me very quickly back to Moray, because it will be, Douglas Ross will be in a position anyway because he would have been on the list. So,
and he's not standing in Moray.
Yes,
Hollywood. So.
Exactly. So basically, he's going to be both places if he gets in.
Yes, absolutely. So
both in the job in Westminster and also a job in Edinburgh. And there's a lot of people frown on that. Alex Salmond did others do it as well. But a lot of people frown on that.
Yeah, they do, and I suspect he will come under some pressure over that over the next few months. I suppose the counter-argument the Conservatives would make is if he is the man who's trying to connect the UK government and the Scottish Parliament, it's good to be in both. But double jobbing's always been a bit controversial.
Nick, for now, thank you very much. And we're joined now by Richard Tice, Reform UK Party leader. Richard Tice, compared with what you thought you might achieve at this stage in the game, where are you?
Yeah, look, thank you. I mean, obviously, it's not easy building a new political brand at the back end of a pandemic when people are being locked down. And, we've learned some lessons. Of course, we'd have liked to have done a bit better, but Rome's not built in a day. This has always been the beginning of a journey for us. That journey.
But isn't the momentum running away from you? Excuse me, I'm afraid we're just going to have to go to Edinburgh West, which is about to declare.
We'll go then.
We'll come back to you.
Go, ladies and gentlemen. To make first constituency declaration. I, Andrew Kerr, returning officer for the Edinburgh Western constituency, declare that the total number of votes given to each candidate was as follows. Alex Cole-Hamilton, Scottish Liberal Democrats, 25,578. Daniel Fraser, Scottish Libertarian Party, 201. Margaret Arma Graham, Scottish Labour Party, 2,515. Sarah Masson, Scottish National Party, 15,693. And Sue Webber, Scottish Conservative and Unionist Party, 2,798. Therefore, I give public notice that Alex Cole-Hamilton is duly elected as a member for the Scottish Parliament for the Edinburgh Western constituency.
So there we've got the result in Edinburgh Western, and indeed it is a victory not unexpected for the Liberal Democrat Alex Cole-Hamilton. We can look at the share of the vote, and the Liberal Democrats have 54%, SNP 34%, Conservative 6% and Labour 5%. And we see the Liberal Democrats actually put on their vote there and the Conservatives lost, and that's yet another sign of tactical voting. Going to the party you think it can most represent in that area the Unionist vote. So the SNP to Liberal Democrat swing is 6.8%. But we go back now to Richard Tice from the Reform UK party. Look, Richard Tice, Reform managed a few hundred votes in the Hartlepool by-election. You talk about Rome never being built in a day, but you are like the lost city of Atlantis. You have nowhere to go. You know, from Brexit to UKIP, there's nowhere for you.
No, complete nonsense. We're building a new political brand. The reality is there's a huge realignment going on. The Conservatives have moved to the left of centre. They've taken the Labour ground very successfully. But as we come out of the pandemic and as we look forward to trying to recover from this, the question is who's going to pay the bills? How are we going to create a high growth, low tax, high productivity environment? And that's very much what we want to be talking about, because at the moment, what the Conservatives are going to be presenting to people in 1 to 2 years' time is some very high tax bills, lots of regulations, and that's going to lead to low growth. So that's going to be the big debating point over the next couple of years, and we want to be a part of that, because there's no one pitching for a high growth, low tax agenda, which is going to be the way that you get higher wages, you get more tax revenues to invest in public services. So that's no longer the pitch of the Conservative Party, and that's the pitch we're going to make, as well as how we're going to reform the public service to make them work more efficiently and faster for us, the taxpaying public.
Sorry to interrupt you, but actually, that's not the pitch that's going to go down well in Hartlepool. And the Tories had a stunning victory in Hartlepool today, which would suggest that the Tories are doing a pretty good job with appealing to the 360 who support the Conservative Party. And actually, there's no room for another party that actually takes the right position at the moment.
The point is the Conservatives moved to the left, which is why they've taken the Labour vote in very big numbers, because they're opening the chequebook. They put a big cuddly arm around everybody with furlough, and I had people say to me in Hartlepool, "We want some of Boris's money," and that's essentially. But at some point, the debate's going to shift. It's going to change, and it's going to be, well, who's going to pay the bills, and how are we going to create some growth in order to start growing our way out of this crisis rather than taxing our way out of the crisis, and that's very much the debate that we want to be having. So we're looking forwards, not backwards. That's what this is going to be about. And we've got to create some growth in this country, because you look at the Chancellor's recent budget, for example, his medium-term growth was the lowest for 60 years, and we've got the highest tax take for 70 years. And I wonder how long people are going to actually, once they've come out of this pandemic, how long are people really going to want that to be the future and the ambition? We need to be much more ambitious, much more high growth, and we want to be a part of that debate. And who's going to pay the cost of the Tories' green agenda?
Actually, you might say increased tax receipts might pay the cost of that. And when you look like someone like Ben Houchen in Tees Valley and what he's doing with buying an airport, with a free port, that's the way you build growth. You build small, agile, fleet-of-foot businesses in those areas, and then that's the way that you build the economy.
And of course, there's no one who's been advocating free ports more than me. I was talking about it back in 2016. But we've got to create growth, not just in those areas, across the whole country. And that requires measures to support small businesses, the self-employed that have been completely abandoned by this government. These are the things. And we've got to have yes, we all want to reduce emissions, but we want to do it in a smart way with technology that creates and saves British jobs, not sends them overseas. And we don't want to send all our money towards renewable companies located offshore, for example. So these are the big challenges that are going to be faced over the next couple of years, and we want to be very much part of that debate.
Reeta Tice, thank you so much for joining us. Well, we are now joined by BBC's political editor in Scotland, Sarah Smith. Sarah, where stands Scotland?
Well, no change thus far. Of all the seats we've had declared in Scotland so far, only 2 of them have changed hands, and they've both been gains for the SNP. It's looking extremely likely. I think every party would acknowledge that the SNP are going to be the largest party. They're going to form the next government. They're 4th in a row, which is a truly remarkable achievement.
19 years it
yes,
will be
exactly.
by 2026.
So it's not often that a party who's been in power for 3 terms is returned again. Are they going to get more than 65 seats and have an overall majority? That still hangs in the balance. It seems pretty likely that even if they don't, there will be enough Scottish Greens returned that there will be a pro-independence majority in the next Parliament, and that could have real consequences.
So do you think that in any way, is there any less legitimacy for a second independence referendum request just because you don't have an overall majority if you are aligned with other pro-independence parties?
Well, the SNP would tell you not, that the electorate have clearly voted for parties who advocate having another independence referendum. They have a majority in the Parliament, therefore it should go ahead. But let's look at some of the history on this. The last Parliament had a pro-independence majority with the SNP and the Greens together. That Parliament even passed a motion saying they wanted to have another referendum, but the Prime Minister, the then Prime Minister Theresa May, felt able to say no. But in 2007, when the SNP did achieve an overall majority, well, that's in 2011, when they got an overall majority, that's when David Cameron agreed to allow a referendum.
What has happened since then, which is, as it were, consolidated that feeling among the SNP, is that we have had Brexit. And we had a situation where 62% of people in Scotland voted to remain in the UK. And what the SNP would say was that was a total disregard of the democratic wishes of the people of Scotland.
And that may be what's changed some of the electoral arithmetic here in Scotland, and you've seen the SNP really consolidate both in Westminster seats, and it looks as though they're going to in Holyrood. Since then, it's probably hardened a lot of people's desire to have another referendum and to see an independent Scotland. Will it change the Prime Minister's mind? Because this is what it comes down to. The SNP will say that he can't ignore democracy if there is a majority in favour of independence, but everything Boris Johnson has said thus far suggests that he is ready to say, I will not allow that referendum, and it would be harder for him to deny it, I think, if the SNP had an outright majority.
Yes. So, and we are hoping to have this guest on tonight in Newsnight, Keir Martin, who was the civil servant in 2012 who drew up the Edinburgh Agreement that led to the independence referendum. And what he says is, you can rule with the consent of the people who wish to be part of the United Kingdom, but if that consent is essentially removed by the idea that you've got a majority or pro-independence and you're ruling simply by the law, it's called know your place unionism, and that will not fly.
And it will have real political consequences, because I think everybody accepts, including in the Conservative Party in Westminster, that if you say you cannot have a referendum, we will stand in your way when it looks as though there is an electoral mandate to have one. That will push more Scottish voters towards the pro-independence cause. So you are storing up trouble for the long run.
And the other thing is, in this election, neither actually the Liberal Democrats or indeed the Labour Party had any response at all to what they would do in the event that Nicola Sturgeon pushes for a Scottish referendum, a second Indy referendum, and Boris Johnson pushes back. They had no answer to that. And really, the question is, do you go with Nicola Sturgeon or do you go with Boris Johnson? For both the Liberal Democrats and the Labour, I would suggest that would be catastrophic for their own position.
Oh, it's extremely difficult for them. I mean, they both say, we don't want another referendum and we will not vote for one in the Parliament. But if the Parliament votes for one without them, yes, exactly as you say, whose side are they on? Because you can track a lot of the troubles of the Scottish Labour Party to when they sided with the Conservatives in the 2014 referendum, and they were seen campaigning together in favour of the Union. But now the Tories have managed to paint themselves as the party of the Union, the ones who will most staunchly stand against Nicola Sturgeon, and they're picking up unionist votes. We can certainly see that in the North East, where we saw a significant swing to them.
But there's also a thought lot in the Conservative Party which says, bring it on. Bring on a referendum. Don't be feared. Say, actually, yes, we're going to give you a referendum because this would be a decision for a generation.
Yes.
That would be the case. So why deny, if you think, you know, you're going to win, then go for the referendum. And maybe actually Boris Johnson, counterintuitively, because we know he does lots of strange things at strange times for interesting reasons, might be minded to say, OK, you can have it, but you're going to have it damn fast.
Well, there is certainly an argument for that, because I think the sooner you have it, the more chance Boris Johnson has of winning and Scotland staying in the United Kingdom. It's difficult, of course, with the pandemic, and Nicola Sturgeon has been criticised for sounding like she wants to go too quickly, because their policy is to go in the first half of this Parliament, so by late 2023, and people are not in favour of the idea of mixing a referendum with a COVID recovery.
However, if Nicola Sturgeon takes care of the COVID recovery and another big beast, say Angus Robertson, comes in from Edinburgh Central and takes over the planning for the idea of an independence referendum, that would separate out, and she could be seen as the stateswoman who's carrying on leading our country.
Absolutely, and I mean, as you were saying, if the Prime Minister is cunning enough to go quickly, they've probably got a better chance. But we're still looking at polls, even now over the last year, it's pretty much 50-50. Recently, seen a little bit more support creeping back towards the Union, but of course, anything can happen in the course of a referendum campaign.
Sarah, fantastic, thanks very much. Huw.
Well, let's just pause for a second, because we're about to have yet another string of results, not just from Scotland, but from Wales as well. And we'll be topping them up as we go along with some of the results of the English local authorities too, which are still coming in. In Welsh terms, this is the picture really as we understand it. The UKIP vote, which was really high in Wales in 2016, has pretty much evaporated. And where it's gone, as far as we can measure it so far, is that it's led to a kind of 5% boost for Labour and 5% boost to the Conservatives, with Plaid Cymru pretty much flat. And Plaid Cymru, I think, would have expected to be not running flat in this Senedd election. They'd have been expecting to be shown to make some kind of gain. So we'll talk to one of Plaid's members, the Deputy Leader, Rhun Iorwerth, in a second. But let's just look at some of these battlegrounds first with Reeta, so that we get a bit of context. And I'm just being told that Swansea West has been held by Labour. That's not a surprise. But a Conservative to Labour swing of 2.1%. So again, just showing that Welsh Labour is managing to stave off the challenge. So Reeta, just take us through some of these before we talk to our next guest.
Interesting, isn't it? A very different sort of pattern in Wales for Labour than in England. And you can see that from this board here, the latest results. 6 Labour holds here, 1 Conservative hold and 1 Conservative gain. I want to show you a couple of the Labour holds. So Wrexham, which the Conservatives won in the general election in 2019. Labour has hung on to this seat here. Leslie Griffiths with a majority of 1,350. So let's just have a look at what happened to the share of the vote there. So Labour and Conservative just up a little smidge. Actually, Plaid benefiting a lot from the drop in the UKIP vote. So interesting there in Wrexham. But Labour have hung on, and they will be, of course, very relieved about that. Now, I want to show you also Delyn, which similarly in that northeast corner of the nation there. And this was also another Westminster seat that the Conservatives won in 2019, but Hannah Blethyn has hung on to it here with a healthy majority of nearly 4,000. And let's just take a look at what has happened to the share of the vote. So this was the share. She got 48%, the Conservatives 35%, Plaid on 8%. And both Labour and the Conservatives have gone up there, and they've both apparently benefited from the drop in the UKIP vote and the drop in the Lib Dems and Plaid. Show you one other seat, which is the one that the Conservatives have gained. Now, this is the Vale of Clwyd. Tiny majority there for Gareth Davies. He's just pipped the Labour candidate to the post there, but this has always been Labour in the Assembly. You can see it going back all those years. And let's take a look here at what's happened to the share of the vote. So that's the overall raw share, but that's the share change 5 percentage points by the Conservatives. Labour's gone up a little bit as well, actually. I mean, they've all gone up a little bit, which does suggest that there's somebody else who hasn't been standing this time round, and their votes have been reapportioned. And let's see what else we can see here. So that is a swing from Labour to Conservative of 2.3%.
Reeta, thanks very much. That gives us a bit of context. And of course, we're interested too in those areas where the battle is between Labour and Plaid Cymru, because that's going to be an interesting outcome for us to see, not just in places like the Rhondda, for example, where the party leader at the time, Leanne Wood, unseated one of the most prominent Labour ministers at the time, Leighton Andrews, but also in other parts of Wales where that's the kind of competition we're looking at, including Llanelli, by the way. So we'll see what happens when that comes along. What I'd like to do now is go to Ynys Môn, to Anglesey, and bring in Plaid Cymru's member for Ynys Môn, Rhun ap Iorwerth, who's also the deputy leader. Noswaith ar Rhun, and congratulations on your re-election, first of all. Rhun, can you hear me?
Yes, I'm delighted to have been re-elected with a clear... I can hear you, yes, Huw, and if you can hear me, what I'm saying is that I'm delighted to have had strong support once again to continue representing the wonderful island of Anglesey, the Ynys Môn constituency.
I think you have the record of our 9 hours of broadcasting, Rhun, of having the longest delay of the lot on the line. But as a seasoned broadcaster yourself, it won't bother you at all. I'm just going to ask you, first of all, where do you think Plaid Cymru will be proud of its performance on these elections? And are you pleased with what you've heard so far?
Well, people will have had that pause to think, what's he going to say now? What I'm going to say is that, in places like Ynys Môn, where we have been able to show that we are a party of the community, and where we were sitting on good, solid majorities before, we've been able to stretch those majorities. This is a party that is a grassroots party in many ways, but it's a party that is building a nation. That is our project, to build a more prosperous Wales, to build a more confident Wales, and whatever the individual results that I will have time to reflect on. I know you'll forgive me, Huw, for not having had time to do that yet. What I will reflect on is the growing confidence in that debate on nationhood that I have felt throughout Wales, even if we haven't got some of the results that we wanted in some individual constituencies today.
You're not confident that you'll increase your number of seats in the Senedd after all this?
I can't tell. I've been stuck in a constituency bubble here for the past few hours in the count, so I'm not in a position yet where I can really reflect on what has happened or what is likely to happen elsewhere even. But the context of the election is quite difficult when you're coming off the back of a pandemic where a government has had a huge amount of exposure, where thankfully things like vaccine programmes have been running well and they're able to look to build on the credit for that, and the same way as the Conservatives have been able to do in England. That's the context of this election. But as I say, through all of that, even when we haven't been getting the results that we wanted in individual seats so far, that debate on where we're heading as Wales seems to me to have taken a change of direction. I've certainly felt it on the ground here on Anglesey over the past few weeks, even by people who haven't been convinced entirely on the question of independence, for example. They want to talk about it. That's exciting.
Well, OK, they want to talk about it, but really, you want them to vote for you. And on the basis of what we've seen so far, Rhun, I'm just... we haven't had them all in, I accept. But on the basis of what we've seen so far, it's not a great set of elections for Plaid. And if that is the case, what conclusions will you draw from that in terms of the way that you discuss the whole concept of independence and gauge the true popularity of it among Welsh voters?
It's a very, very important question, and no doubt over the next few days and indeed weeks, because it does take time to chew the cud over an election result. We will reflect on that. I know that I've had more conversations about independence, for example, on the doorstep, and I know that I've increased the majority here in Ynys Môn. So when you are able to have to frame the debate in a way that people feel they can engage with, where they want to actually talk nitty-gritty and talk pragmatism and talk how will this happen, how will that happen, we can take strides forward. But when you have an election that is in the context of COVID, a positive picture, thankfully, in terms of COVID in Wales now, as I say, a successful story in terms of vaccination, you have a government that is able to solidify its position, if you like.
Rhun ap Iorwerth, thank you very much for joining us, and we'll maybe talk to some of your colleagues later on as well. Thanks very much. Let's go to the latest declaration.
Being the returning officer for the Scottish parliamentary election for the Dumfriesshire constituency, hereby give notice that the total number of votes polled for each candidate was as follows. Richard John Brodie, Scottish Liberal Democrats, 1,314. Joan McAlpine, Scottish National Party SNP, 15,421. Oliver Mundell, Scottish Conservative and Unionist Party, 19,487. Colin Smith, Scottish Labour Party and Scottish Cooperative Party, 4,671. I hereby declare that Oliver Mundell has been duly elected to serve as the member of the Scottish Parliament for the Dumfriesshire constituency. The number of ballot papers rejected and not counted by me.
That result, that is Oliver Mundell, the son of David Mundell, who was the Secretary of State for Scotland, has been returned, and a strong challenge there for the SNP. Nick Eardley was saying that the SNP had high hopes. Joan McAlpine, who at the moment is a list MSP, she was challenging Oliver Mundell. If we want to look at that result in Dumfriesshire, we can see in terms of share of the vote, the Conservatives are on 48% of the vote, and the SNP on 38 and Labour on 11. Now look at that vote in terms of the Unionist vote, and the change shows that 10% increase in the Conservative vote in Dumfriesshire and a 14% drop in the Labour vote. SNP are up 4, but that's really interesting because that's a straight Labour to Conservative tactical voting on behalf of the Union. So that Unionist vote is consolidating all the way through the day. We're joined now by our correspondent Alan Little. What do you make of that?
This is very strong, isn't it? And the Conservatives started this tactic under Ruth Davidson when they said at the 2017 general election, we are the dependable, robust, vigorous party of the Union. If you care about the Union, abandon your old tribal party loyalties and come to us. And it's bearing fruit because it's very striking how much tactical voting there is against the SNP in many constituencies here. So what we're seeing is that the old left-right duopoly that dominated British politics for 100 years is giving way in Scotland, or has already given way to two new tribes called Yes and No, Union and Independence.
Except they're not new, aren't they? Because they were there in 2014. So actually, it's a repurposing of that divide.
It is. It's what the 2014 referendum started by redefining the fault line in Scottish politics. Brexit did the same thing in the rest of the UK by redefining where the fault line in politics lies.
I mean, this is your territory, home territory in Dumfriesshire, and that was once a Labour area. Now it's consolidating behind the Conservatives.
It was, and of course that part of the country is fertile territory for the SNP as well. Yeah. Galloway has had SNP MPs and indeed MSPs and tends to swing between the Conservatives and the SNP. Of course, Labour squeezed everywhere by this.
So the other one that, of course, we're still waiting for is Ayr, third in the list. The majority there only 750. That was one, sorry, that we're waiting for Edinburgh Central, which is Conservative majority of 610. And indeed, the SNP are much more confident in Edinburgh Central.
They are, and Edinburgh Central, if they win that with Angus Robertson, that will be a net gain. Whereas if they win Ayr is in the south of Scotland, and if they win Ayr as a constituency, they might lose one of their list MSPs in the south of Scotland. So that would, in a sense, cancel it out when it comes to totals.
But the one that we're waiting for now is Dumbarton, because we know that there's been some delay in Dumbarton. It is the seat with the least majority in Scotland. It's 109, and that's what we're really going to be looking for. So, as I was beginning to say to Nick earlier, we mustn't underestimate the fact that we talk about the constituencies, but that's constituencies are, form 73, the list is 56, and that was that system designed to make sure there was an overall majority. It hasn't worked out that way, but it'll certainly bring, we haven't heard much about the Greens today, it's going to bring the Greens back in, it's going to bring more Liberal Democrat MSPs in. It's going to alter the picture quite radically.
It will be very interesting to see how this tactical voting tactic by the Conservatives plays out with the so-called peach paper. They made a great deal about the peach paper,
list paper,
and the second vote we all had, which is the list. Because if the tactical voting has worked as well in the list as it seems to have worked for them in the constituencies, then we can. It'll change. We'll still be talking this time tomorrow, Kirsty. We still won't know this time tomorrow.
Let's hope so.
It'll go to the wire.
Alan, thanks very much.
Well, thanks to Alan and Kirsty. We'll be back with them shortly. We were talking earlier about the big Labour Plaid Cymru struggle in Wales, which Labour are looking quite healthy in at this stage. The Rhondda, which is, of course, one of the most iconic valleys that you can think of in terms of coal mining and the industrial past, that was taken by Leanne Wood, the then leader of Plaid Cymru, back in 2016 against Labour's Leighton Andrews. And she was standing again, Leanne Wood, in this campaign. Well, I've just had a message from one very senior Labour figure in Wales saying that they're looking to an easy win in the Rhondda. He's suggesting that it's going to be a pretty painful defeat for Leanne Wood of Plaid Cymru. No result in yet, but I'm just telling you what they're telling me, so that's quite significant as well. What's happening then in the northwest of England? We were talking about the mayoral contest in Liverpool earlier on and the issues around that, and of course some of the important local authority battles as well. I'm going to bring in Eunice Muller, who's in Salford. I think you get the prize for being the most patient contributor of the day, Eunice. I'm going to tell you that for nothing. So thank you very much. Bring us up to date then on local authorities first. Let's deal with Liverpool second, if we can.
OK. Well, Labour's managed to hold on to a number of councils where the counts have come in. They've managed to stay red. So, for example, Greater Manchester, Rochdale and Oldham. Although in Oldham, the leader there, Councillor Sean Fielding, lost his seat to an independent. In Lancashire, Labour held on to Blackburn with Darwen and Chorley, but there have also been disappointments. If you look at Lancashire again, in Rosendale, the Conservatives picked up seats there. That's now under no overall control. Also, Stockport, now that's hugely significant as well. That was under no overall control. Labour was the largest party there, but no longer the case. The Liberal Democrats are the largest party there, and that's hugely significant. Across in Merseyside, Labour's managed to hold on to Liverpool and in Walton. But as you say, it's the mayoral contest, which is also perhaps quite interesting here in the northwest. 4 mayors' jobs are up for grabs, including that directly elected mayoral seat in Liverpool. Now, last year, the previous mayor, Joe Anderson, faced those allegations of bribery and witness intimidation as part of a police investigation. So he stepped down. He's always denied any wrongdoing. There have been no charges, but that investigation is still ongoing. So Labour then had this troubled process in finding some kind of replacement, and they eventually settled on Joanne Anderson, an inexperienced councillor. And then against that backdrop, we had this government inspection which pointed at significant failings in that authority. So this was going to be an interesting contest, and in that mayoral contest, it had to go to a second preferences. Basically, no candidate got more than 50%, and so they went to second preferences, and eventually Joanne Anderson was declared the victor there. So that's quite an interesting development there. We're also expecting, of course, the results of the other mayoral contest, including that one here in Greater Manchester. Andy Burnham, a high-profile figure. He had those conflicts with the government over funding during the pandemic, but we're not expecting that result until tomorrow. Interestingly, the turnout there in Greater Manchester for that contest is in its mid-30s.
Eunice, Kirsty here in Edinburgh. Just looking at Wigan, a seat of Lisa Nandy. Not a single Labour councillor lost there, and of course she was the challenger for the Labour leadership. She stood against Keir Starmer. Does that say something about Lisa Nandy's style of politics or the politics in that area?
Well, a number of councils have managed to stay under no overall control. So, of course, there was that fear that perhaps Labour could be vulnerable in those seats. But we know Lisa Nandy and her views during that Brexit campaign. But Labour's managed to do OK there. As I say, a number of other areas as well, including Burnley, for example, stays under no overall control, but also Bolton as well. A number of key areas here in the northwest.
Looking at Labour's performance
Thank you very much, Eunice.
Across the north of England, it's interesting that there seems to be a split between the northeast and the northwest. Are Labour holding up more strongly in the northwest, and why do you think that is?
Well, I'm not sure that Eunice heard us there, actually. Eunice, are you still with us?
Sorry, Hugh. I thought that was it for me.
No, sorry.
I'm happy to stay here for a few minutes.
Sorry. I think we're trying to make it up to you, actually. That's what's going on. Vicky's with me here in the studio, and she wanted to put a question to you as well. So I hope you can hear what she has to say.
Eunice, it was just about Labour's performance in the north east and the northwest, and that difference where in the northwest Labour seem to be holding up better. Do you think that's a fair reflection of what's going on? Do Labour feel that they've got a stronger performance in your area?
I mean, there is a fair reflection so far, but as I said, a number of results are not in yet. We're still awaiting a lot of those results across in Merseyside and in Lancashire as well. So perhaps, obviously, what they're hoping for is that they don't get that repeat that we've seen in the north east.
Good. Thank you very much, Eunice. We'll let you go now. Thanks a lot.
Thank you.
Thank you very much. There you are. He waits ages and then he gets, three all at once asking questions. OK, so what are we doing next? OK, well, this is Chris, my director, talking to me now and giving me a lot of trouble, OK? So he's telling me to chat to Vicky, which I now do. So the issue is this, Vicky. If we look at areas like the northwest, we just heard there, and Liverpool, as Eunice was telling us, you just wonder if you're Keir Starmer listening to that, and listening to the analysis of what Labour's challenge has been in areas like that and what it's failed to come up with, it brings us back to the conversation I was having to you earlier. What does he mean by a pretty radical restart, really, a pretty radical relaunch, if you like, regardless of the sensitivities of some people in the party? I'm just beginning to wonder what that looks like.
Yeah, well, I mean, we don't know, and I think that's part of the problem. Now, his team would say it's not fair to judge him yet because, yes, he's been leader for a year, but it's not been normal political times. He came in, and within weeks, I think we were a week away from the lockdown. I remember doing an interview with him, and we were, just
Vicky,
before
I'm
that
really sorry. We'll make the point. I'm going to Bridgend, which is in South Wales. Let's see what's going on there.
Constituency declare that the total number of votes given to each candidate was as follows.
Roedd fi, Mark Shepherd, swyddog canlyniadau etholol ar gyfer etholaeth Pen-y-bont ar Ogwr yn datgan bod cyfanswm nifer...
So lots of candidates in Bridgend, in South Wales. They'll go through them all, but this is where Carwyn Jones, the former First Minister, was a member.
James Bledsoe, Independent, 3,046.
Stephen James Bledsoe, Annibynnol.
So again, in this one, it was to see whether the Conservatives and Labour would come on top. So let's see.
Carolyn Yvonne Jones, Independent, 1,064.
Caroline Yvonne Jones.
In the general election, this seat went to the Conservatives, so Labour have been a bit nervous, but let's see.
Geraint David Jones, Gwlad, the Welsh Independence Party, 232.
Geraint David Jones, Gwlad, Plaid Annibynnol, 232.
Harvey Richard Jones, Welsh Liberal Democrats put recovery first, 782.
Harvey Richard Jones, Democratiaid Rhyddfrydol Cymru, adfywio yw'r blaenoriaeth, 782.
Leanne Elizabeth Lewis, Plaid Cymru, the Party of Wales, 3,091.
Leanne Elizabeth Lewis, Plaid Cymru, the Party of Wales, 3,091.
Sarah Murphy, Welsh Labour, 12,388.
That looks like a Labour win, doesn't it?
Sarah Murphy, Llafur Cymru, £30,388.
Rachel Nugent-Finn, Welsh Conservative Party candidate, 8,324.
Yes, so Welsh Labour will be breathing a big sigh of relief there because they've come in with a very strong performance and a pretty solid majority.
Christine Ann Roach, Reform UK, Changing Politics for Good, 534.
Christine Ann Roach, Reform UK, Changing Politics for Good, 534.
Therefore, I give public notice.
So let's just underline what's gone on there as we look at these figures, because I was telling you earlier about all of these constituencies, basically where lots of these old Labour seats went to the Conservatives at the last election, and the great nervousness for Labour was that this would repeat itself. Well, doesn't seem to be happening, and this is another seat which, when Conservative are the general, look at this, Conservative hopes of taking it have been dashed, and Labour have held on, and not just by a modest amount. That is a pretty solid majority there of 4,064. A turnout of 45%, which is basically around the average turnout in Wales for these Senedd elections. Is considerably lower than at the UK general election. Let's go to Edinburgh Central for the next declaration.
Apart from being the only opportunity I get to take my mask off in a day, it's I, Andrew Kerr, returning officer for the Edinburgh Central constituency, declare that the total number of votes given to each candidate was as follows. Bonnie Prince Bob, Independent, 363. Scott Douglas, Scottish Conservative and Unionist Party, 11,544. Alison Johnson, Scottish Green Party, 3,921. Maddie Kirkman, Scottish Labour Party, 6,839. Tam Laird, Scottish Libertarian Party, 137. Donald Murdo Mackay, UK Independence Party, 78. Angus Robertson, Scottish National Party, 16,276. And Bruce Roy Wilson, Scottish Liberal Democrats, 2,555. I therefore give public notice that Angus Robertson is duly elected as a member for the Scottish Parliament for the Edinburgh Central constituency.
So that is a famous victory in Edinburgh Central for the SNP. That was Ruth Davidson's seat. It's now been taken by Angus Robertson, who was the SNP leader at Westminster, and is now most certainly going to go into a job in the Scottish Parliament. He's a very senior figure in the SNP, and this is a victory that was much wanted by Nicola Sturgeon. So let's take us through now the details on that. So the SNP with 39%, the Conservatives 28%, Labour at 16%, and the Greens on 9%. But let's look at the change in the vote there, the change in the vote share. So the SNP have put on 10%, Conservatives down 3%, Labour down 6%, and also the Greens down 4%. So in a sense, Angus Robertson hoovered up the Green vote. He's definitely been the focus of this election, and Conservative SNP swing is 6.6%. This is exactly what Nicola Sturgeon wanted to see, because she wanted to see Angus Robertson. It was a very hard-fought seat to see who would stand in that seat for the SNP, and he's made it.
It was. Joanna Cherry expressed an interest in being the candidate there. Angus Robertson will be a very big figure in the next Scottish Parliament, and it's striking how impressive this victory is. Not a great gig to follow Ruth Davidson as the Conservative candidate. There was a very strong personal vote for her last time round, but this is where that tactical vote, which has worked so well for the Conservatives in hoovering up the other pro-union party supports, hasn't really worked at all here. If you add the Labour vote to the Conservative vote, it comes, it does just get over Angus Robertson's 16,000 and something. but both parties there are a long way. Even if every Labour voter had voted Conservative, they would only just have beaten Angus Robertson. So it's a very strong win for the SNP.
It is, and if you look at this in terms of their top 6 targets, they've now taken 3 of those targets. We're waiting for the top target, which was Dumbarton, Aberdeenshire West and Edinburgh Southern. If they indeed do take those other 2 votes, they are heading for a majority.
They could well, this could be their route to a majority indeed. We have to watch what happens to the list votes though. Remember, the SNP have 4 list MSPs. They're not certain to be re-elected, and so it very much depends where in the country the gains are. But here, it's an important. This is a net gain because in the Lothians, where Edinburgh Central is, the SNP doesn't have any list MSPs, so they've got none to lose. Similarly, in Dumbarton, the SNP doesn't have any list MPs in the west of the country, so they wouldn't have any to lose there.
And let's be quite clear here that Angus Robertson is a very influential person in the party. He is somebody who can be, Nicola Sturgeon would suggest, relied on to do a very senior job in Scotland.
And he's a Nicola Sturgeon loyalist, very close to the First Minister, very strongly on her wing of the party, very strongly supportive of her, very experienced, very highly regarded, particularly by that wing of the party, and many see him as a future First Minister.
Alan, thank you.
Always good to hear from Alan. Thanks very much. It's 7 o'clock. This is obviously our continuing coverage of the elections in England, Wales and Scotland. We've been on air since 9 this morning, and we've had some notable results, which we've talked about. But there are lots more results to come in. In fact, they'll stretch into tomorrow, some of them into Sunday, and if things are going very slowly, some of them into Monday. But those will be just a few dribs and drabs by the end. Today and tomorrow will be most of them coming in, and we should get quite a few before we come off air tonight in about 3 hours' time. So plenty to stay for. We're just going to take a little break and join Shaun for the news.
Huw, thank you very much. Good evening. The Conservatives are celebrating a major victory in the Hartlepool by-election, with the Prime Minister, Boris Johnson, saying the result is a mandate to continue to deliver, not just for the northeast of England, but for the whole country. The Labour Party's vote fell by 9% in the first electoral test for its leader, Sir Keir Starmer. Our political correspondent, Damon Grammaticus, reports.
A Tory triumph, not the balloon. That wasn't the best likeness. But for Boris Johnson, this was another Labour stronghold demolished. Jill Mortimer is the first Conservative MP to represent Hartlepool in 57 years.
If there's a lesson out of this whole election campaign, the whole local election campaign across the whole of the UK, it's that the public want politicians to get on with focusing on their needs and their priorities.
And the region delivered another bitter blow for Labour. Its candidate for Tees Valley Mayor was soundly beaten too. The Conservative incumbent, Ben Houchen, returned with more than 70% of the vote. In council elections, Conservatives took control of Nuneaton and Bedworth in the West Midlands and Basildon in Essex. Glum Labour faces as Harlow in Essex went to the Tories, and Dudley in the West Midlands too.
Well, I'm bitterly disappointed in the results, and I take full responsibility for the results, and I will take full responsibility for fixing things. We have changed as a party, but we haven't set out a strong enough case to the country.
The Greens have been picking up seats here from Labour in Sheffield.
Well done, fantastic.
The Liberal Democrats from the Conservatives in Cambridgeshire. In the Welsh Parliament election, Labour has lost the Vale of Clwyd to the Conservatives, but held on elsewhere.
Well done.
Scotland's Parliament is where the result could be the most consequential. The SNP has taken air. The question here, can Nicola Sturgeon get an overall majority, and will she use it to push for independence?
Extremely happy and extremely confident that we are on track in the SNP for a 4th consecutive election victory and to have the ability to form a government again, and that's an extraordinary achievement for any political party.
North and south of the border, the final shape of things will only be clear over the weekend, but what happens in Scotland could take some of the wind out of Boris Johnson's celebrations. Damon Grammaticus, BBC News.
In other news this evening, Portugal, Gibraltar and Israel are among 12 countries which people in England will be able to travel to from the 17th of May without having to quarantine on their return home. Popular destinations such as Spain, France and Italy are not yet on what's called the Green List, which means there are minimum requirements for travellers. The Transport Secretary Grant Shapps says the list will be expanded, but only when it's safe to do so.
The signs overseas are now more promising as a result of their vaccination programmes beginning to crank up. And as the summer progresses, we hope that more traditional tourist destinations will be unlocked. But we have to turn the key slowly. And green list countries will be placed on a watch list if we start to have any concerns. And if it's necessary because of a new upswing in cases or a new variant, we'll not hesitate to act fast and withdraw green status.
The Joint Committee on Vaccination and Immunisation has recommended that people under the age of 40 should be offered an alternative vaccine to the AstraZeneca jab after concerns about blood clots. The age threshold is being raised as a precautionary measure. England's Deputy Chief Medical Officer, meanwhile, says the UK is still on course to give every adult at least one coronavirus vaccine dose by the end of July. Police in Kent are appealing to the public to help identify a man who was seen close to where the police community support officer Julia James was killed. They've released this photograph of the man. It was taken in Kent the day after the 53-year-old died. Julia was found dead in woodland near her home 10 days ago. A post-mortem revealed she died from significant head injuries. And the election results will keep coming in over the next few days. For live coverage of those results and expert analysis of what they mean for you, do visit our website or, of course, use the BBC News app. That's it from me until the top of 8 o'clock. Now, though, back to Elections 2021.
Welcome back to the BBC's election coverage with me and Kirsty. We're keeping an eye on all these results coming in from across England, Scotland and Wales. We've seen some very significant results already. And Kirsty, just going back there to Angus Robertson being elected there in Edinburgh, and I just thought, well, there's a big political beast who's going to be taking his place in the Scottish Parliament.
Yeah, a very big political beast, and as Alan Little was just saying, very close to Nicola Sturgeon, very much on her wing of the party, very much in tune with her at her attitude towards the progression towards another independence referendum, and that indeed is the case. There's no doubt that she's going to want him closely by her side in the Scottish Parliament. He'll come in, and I imagine he will go straight into a very big job in the Parliament. So that is a very big, and it was actually a terrific majority in Edinburgh Central. Obviously, you know, Ruth Davidson, a hard act to follow, no particular recognition for her successor, and yet everybody does know Angus Robertson because he was the SNP leader at Westminster. So from that point of view, this is a very significant moment for Nicola Sturgeon. What we're also waiting for tonight is Dumbarton, which is the one with the littlest majority, 109 in Scotland. And we're going to get that before 9 o'clock tonight, we understand. And when that happens, then we're going to be even clearer about the SNP's trajectory. But right now, there has been quite a lot happening. So I want to bring in David Wallace-Lockhart to just get us up to speed. Where are we?
Well, after that result for Angus Robertson, here are the number of seats we're currently sitting on in Scotland. The SNP on 35, the Lib Dems on 4, the Conservatives on 2, Labour have none and the Greens have none. But let's remember, the Conservative, Labour and the Greens are expected to pick up the majority of their seats when the regional list results are announced tomorrow. So 3 seats have changed hands so far. East Lothian, if we remember, is one of them. The SNP took it with a majority of just over 1,100 votes. It's a gain from Labour. If you look at the share of those votes, those who oppose independence have potentially split between the Conservatives and Labour, allowing the SNP to make that gain. Let's cross now to the other side of Scotland, to Ayr. The former Conservative MSP, John Scott, had held the seat for 20 years. The SNP has taken it with a slim majority of 170 votes. It's another key gain for the SNP along with Edinburgh Central. Now, let's look at an example of where there might have been tactical voting. Edinburgh Western. It's a Lib Dem seat, and the Lib Dems held with a big increase in their majority, up to 10,000 votes now. And what's interesting is to look at the vote change. The Conservative vote is down a lot. Labour is slightly down. So did the supporters of these parties back the Lib Dems as the party best placed to beat the SNP? Now, we can have a look at our hex map, which shows every constituency in Scotland at the same size. 41 seats filled in so far. 3 have changed hands. 3 seats that could be crucial in the path towards an outright SNP majority. Though a strong performance is still needed for that, we'll have to wait until tomorrow to complete this picture and to get the regional list seat results.
David, thanks very much. And just a very quick one, Alan. The Ayr new MSP, Siobhan Brown, is head of the Ayr Tourist Board. That's a pretty good job if you want to be MSP. You get to know everybody and you say great things about the town. That's you know, getting a very local candidate.
That is a remarkable result, actually, for the Conservatives to have held that seat for such a long time and to lose it now. But these margins are tiny. These are just literally hundreds of people deciding whether, in the end, there's going to be an SNP overall majority in the next Scottish Parliament. So I'm very struck by how tight so many of these races are. And despite the big movements between the unionist parties, that Edinburgh Western result is very telling, where clearly many Natural Labour and Conservative Party supporters voted for the Lib Dem candidate to keep the Scottish Nationalist out. That is the great feature, I think, of this election. It is the discipline shown by the Unionist Party most likely to win.
The discipline and people doing their sums very carefully.
Yes, yeah, clearly. It reveals quite a strong level of psephological knowledge among the electorate. The electorates do seem to know which candidate is most likely to keep the SNP candidate out in these constituencies. It's very striking. It would be very interesting to drill into some of those numbers later.
Yeah, and let's just return very briefly to Dumbarton, majority of 109. Like John Scott, the Conservative has just been ousted in Ayr. Jackie Baillie has been there with the bricks since 1999. You know, she's been a stalwart of the Labour Party. She's deputy leader. She's got them out of lots of fixes, but you know, it might be all over for her in terms of the constituency tonight.
Well, one of the longest serving, yeah, she's been in since the very beginning, and she's a strong constituency MP. I was there interviewing her only a few weeks ago, and constituents approached her and interrupted our interview, and she stopped the interview and to deal with the constituents' concerns. And she said, when you've got a majority of 109, that's what you do.
Thanks very much, Alan. And we can be joined now by Angus Robertson, the new SNP MSP for Edinburgh Central. Congratulations. You have now returned, as it were, to a position. You were a leader at Westminster. You are now going to be by Nicola Sturgeon's side in the Scottish Parliament. What is the key thing that you have to do in that regard?
Win as many seats as we can in the election, Kirsty. We're not even half the way through, but I observe that the SNP is gaining seats after 3 terms in government and now heading towards a fourth term in government. I think by any neutral assessment comparing Scotland with other normal European countries, it is a remarkable achievement that the SNP has so far been polling so strongly and winning additional seats. In Edinburgh Central, it's the best result that the SNP has ever had, and we have, of course, just won. We have just gained the seat that was held by the leader of the Scottish Conservative Party, Ruth Davidson.
What do you think has changed since you lost Murray in 2017? What has changed?
The Brexit result is the biggest single factor that's impacted on people's thinking, and that was especially the case in Edinburgh Central. Edinburgh is the strongest pro-European part of Scotland, and Scotland, of course, voted by 62% to remain in the European Union. But we've been taken out against our democratic will. This has had a huge impact for a lot of people, and is one of the reasons why the SNP vote went up so heavily in Edinburgh Central. We were the strong pro-European party, and people wanted to vote for a pro-European party, and they also wanted to vote for a party that trusts people to have a democratic say in the country's future, and that is exactly what will happen if the SNP wins this election.
Nicola Sturgeon has repeatedly said that she'll be back at her desk on Monday morning dealing with the pandemic and its after effects, because that is her principal focus. She has assiduously not talked about Indy Ref 2, but presumably as you move forward, Angus Robertson, that will be very much front and centre of your thinking.
Well, you're quite right. Nicola Sturgeon, the SNP's first priority is dealing with the pandemic as it faces all of us around the world. But we need to make sure that the Scottish Parliament has the appropriate powers of a normal country as we emerge from the pandemic to be able to make the best possible decisions for the economic recovery, dealing with public health and restoring our links with the European Union. So in this parliamentary term, we will be doing both of these things. And we do, after all, live in a democracy. So given the people are voting resoundingly for SNP candidates, if the SNP forms a government in the Scottish Parliament, it is for that democratic wish of the people to be respected by everybody.
Fair to say, though, in Edinburgh, it was a no vote in the referendum on independence. 60% voted no, different on the other side of the country.
Sorry, Kirsty, are you saying it's all the more remarkable that the SNP has just won in Edinburgh Central? Well, I think you're right. And I think it shows
what I'm looking forward to is that So I think the coalition of yes voters is changing, isn't it? Because I think what you've got in Edinburgh, in the referendum on independence, the first referendum, 60% in Edinburgh voted against. There you're going to have to shift the dial, but maybe the dial has already shifted in Edinburgh, would be suggested, because of the whole EU Brexit vote.
Well, indeed, the SNP wouldn't be winning Edinburgh Central if people weren't changing their minds. We've gone up from just under 10,000 votes in the last Scottish Parliament election to more than 16,000. So that's quite a jump. I think one of the things that's particularly heartening for me, and it's an important...
We're just going to a declaration. Okay. We're just going to a declaration. Sorry to stop you.
Not quite yet, I think, is the answer. But apologies for cutting across Angus Robertson there. But the count is not quite... there for us. It'll happen quite soon, but we'll come back to it in a moment. It'll be Edinburgh Southern when we get there, but it's not quite ready yet. So while we wait for that, because that's another significant one, what I'd like to do, and again, there'll be people joining us at this stage because you've been out at work and doing other stuff all day, which is perfectly understandable. So just to bring you up to date, we've been alluding there to the SNP's strong performance in many areas of Scotland, the Welsh Labour Party's strong performance in parts of Wales. So let's look at the situation in local authorities in England, because there are 143 local authorities up for election. Not all of them all-out elections, as we say, where every member's being up for election, but some of them by halves and some of them by thirds. So it's a bit of a mixed bag, but we still see certain clear trends. So, Rita, just state to the parties maybe and tell us what's of interest here.
So this is where we are, Huw. We've had 59 of the 143 councils declared, and this is what the scoreboard shows. The Conservatives have 26 councils. They've gained 8 and lost 1. Labour has 25. It's gained none and lost 4. And not too much change in for the other parties, and some of them remain hung. If we take a look at how that translates into councillors, so you can see there is a certain amount of churn there. The Conservatives have gained 159 councillors and Labour has lost 167. Now, Huw was saying that there is a variety of councils that have been up for election this time round. Let me see if my screen will cooperate with me here. Let's just try that again. No. Am I not going to have any luck? I was wanting to show you some of the councils which have changed hands. I'll just give it one more go. There we go. And then try it here. I'm afraid it's not going to work. Huw, you're going to have to come back to me.
We'll come back, Rita. I just think I don't envy you at all, actually, with that screen, because I'd be absolutely dreadful at it. I'd also lose my patience with it within 5 minutes. So you've done brilliantly. So we'll let you fix your screen. And I'm just thinking, OK, local authorities. I understand in Cornwall there's been a Conservative gain, but we're going to go to Edinburgh Southern. Let's go for that declaration. Well, I rushed into that, but they're not quite ready yet. But Edinburgh Southern is the one we're looking at currently, or at least held by Labour, Daniel Johnson.
Can I have your attention, please?
Until this election.
This is the next constituency declaration. I, Andrew Kerr, the returning officer for Edinburgh Southern constituency, declare that the total number of votes given to each candidate was as follows. Miles Briggs, Scottish Conservative and Unionist Party, 5,258. Philip Holden, Scottish Family Party, 317. Daniel Johnson, Scottish Labour Party and Scottish Cooperative Party, 20,760. Katrina Mary Elizabeth MacDonald, Scottish National Party, 16,738. And Fred McIntosh, Scottish Liberal Democrats, 2,189. Therefore, I give public notice that Daniel Johnson, Scottish Labour Party and Scottish Cooperative Party, is duly elected as a member for Edinburgh Southern constituency. And before I ask Daniel to come up and speak...
So Labour has held on to that seat in Edinburgh Southern, and that is the area that's returned the only Labour MP, and Ian Murray, to the Westminster Parliament. So let's take a look at how that election panned out. And in terms of share of the vote, we had there that Labour had 45%, SNP 37%, Conservative 12%, Liberal Democrat 5%, and the change in the share of the vote was that Labour actually dropped 10 percentage points, SNP put on 4%, but the Conservatives lost 14%. So the SNP to Labour swing is 3 percentage points. Just coming to you, Alan, on that, it was pretty certain that actually they would hang on, Labour would hang on in that area. They're actually quite strong in Edinburgh there, in Edinburgh Southern.
They are, and as you say, the last parliamentary constituency in Scotland, the People's Republic of Morningside, as the joke, it was traditionally,
what a thought.
Historically, it was a very solid Conservative seat. And what we see here with the collapse of the Conservative vote down to 5,000, if you told me that 30 years ago, the Conservatives would only get 5,000 in South Edinburgh.
But of course, if you said 20 years ago that Labour would have won MP at Westminster,
exactly.
Nobody would believe you.
It's a measure of what a changed country it is. And clearly, lots and lots of natural Conservative voters backing the Labour candidate there to keep the Nationalist
so
out.
yet more tactical voting in the city.
Yes, a very, very high level of tactical knowledge among the electorates and tactical voting. Yeah,
so what we are looking at now, the key seats to look at tonight are going to be Dumbarton and Eastwood. Because if the SNP take Dumbarton and Eastwood, and then of course we've still got to factor in the list, that puts them in a very strong position heading towards, not getting, because we don't know yet, but heading towards an outright majority. So we're looking for these two seats very carefully, Dumbarton and Eastwood.
It does. They already have one net gain in Edinburgh Central. They've also taken Ayr and East Lothian from their gains as well, although they might lose on the list as a result of gaining them. But if they win Dumbarton and Eastwood, that is their route to an overall majority. This is not supposed to happen in this Parliament. Yeah. The electoral system was designed almost to make it unthinkable that a single party can hold a majority in a five-party race. And it may have happened. This may be the second time.
2011, of course, was the famous time where it did happen. And of course, in 2011, that led directly to the first referendum on Scottish independence.
Indeed.
Which, of course, the no vote was 55 and the yes vote was 45. So, you know, we're in that territory again because it looks like, on the strength of this result so far, that they're going to be looking for another referendum, either with the help of the Greens or without.
Yeah, and that's the other big unknown factor. How strong will the Greens be? And will a Green surge deprive the SNP of one or more of their 4 list MSPs? Because again, that could... The list vote is very, very unreadable. The Conservatives making a great song and dance about the so-called peach paper in this election, the second vote that we all have for the list MSPs. That is very uncallable in this election. It's very hard to tell what effect that will have on those crucial 4 SNP MSP seats from the list.
Interesting, though, you know, we talk regularly in politics about people lending other people their votes for a particular purpose. But actually, when that sometimes happens, it ends up being entrenched.
Yeah.
So you end up having a different, a psephological picture because of that.
Well, we're seeing all over the country, north and south of the border now, traditional tribal loyalties were broken. First of all, by the independence referendum in Scotland, and then by the Brexit referendum in England and Wales. Once somebody has broken with the tradition... When I was working in the so-called Red Wall in the run-up to the 2019 general election, if I heard this phrase once, I heard it 100 times, my father would turn in his grave.
Yes.
You could see that the generations who had voted Labour were for the first time going to not vote Labour, vote Conservative.
But
and once they've done that once that loyalty is broken...
But also, once they'd done it, and then saw in whatever way, through the town's funds or whatever, they saw the benefit of that. Maybe they got to buy their house on a combined income of £40,000. Maybe they got to put their children into a new primary school. Once you see the actual result of voting like that, however much, Labour would say that the local authorities have been denuded and libraries have closed and sports centres have closed, once you see an impact of your vote, you're less likely to return to your old ways.
In both England and Scotland, there were constituencies where the Labour candidate said, we don't count the votes here, we weigh them. Well, that's over.
Absolutely, and that very problem about weighing it leads to another thought about Labour in Scotland, which has been the problem for Labour over the last 15 years, has been the complacency that followed the 1997 general election and the establishment of the Scottish Parliament. Two things there. The first was that George Robertson, one of the most famous things I think he ever said, perhaps the only famous thing he ever said, was devolution will kill nationalism stone dead. And the problem with that was that led to a complacency among the rank and file who went up and down to Westminster in and out every week and more often stayed in Westminster and did not nurse their constituencies properly.
On the night of the 2010 general election, I was at Meadowbank where the Scottish results were being collated, and as seat after seat was tumbling to David Cameron's Conservatives south of the border, every single Labour MP in Scotland held his or her seat, and most of them with an increased majority. That was the last time. That was the high watermark of Fortress Scotland for Labour. The following year, 2011, the vote disappeared. The vote went to the SNP and propelled the SNP into a majority in that building over there, which made a referendum inevitable. And during that referendum campaign in 2013-2014, Labour's vote hemorrhaged away to the Yes campaign. And once that was over, the bond between those traditional Labour constituencies and the Labour candidates that they sent again and again and again to Westminster and Holyrood, that was broken.
Alan, thank you.
Thanks again to Alan there. And just a few points to just pick up very quickly. I'll just run through them. Just hearing that Plaid Cymru have held on to Ceredigion, which has been quite a competitive seat in the past. That's the presiding officer in the Senedd, Ellen Jones, so she's held on. Just another quick word about the constituency lists in Wales, so 20 seats off the lists. They show that the Abolish the Welsh Assembly Party, which is running some candidates in Wales, it's only fighting on the list, by the way, is currently running at 4.5%, says John Curtis, which suggests it may not win a seat in the next Senedd. There had been some forecasts, according to some opinion polls, they could come up with 7 seats or 6 or 7 seats. Anyway, John's suggesting at this point that may not be the case. And a quick word with Vicky, because one of Keir Starmer's frontbenchers resigned a few weeks ago. Vicky, didn't get a lot of attention then, but it's getting more attention today because of what he said.
Yeah, so this is Carlaw Mahmood, a Shadow Defence Minister, and he's talking about the Labour Party. What Kirsty Allen was talking about there is very pertinent to what's going on in England, because the fear amongst lots of Labour MPs is that what happened in Scotland, which is the Labour Party accused of taking its vote for granted for decades, then being virtually wiped out, people lending their votes to others and never coming back. And that's what they fear might be happening in parts of England. But Carlaw Mahmood has said, my view is simple. In the past decade, Labour has lost touch with ordinary British people. A London-based bourgeoisie with the support of brigades of woke social media warriors has effectively captured the party. So this is the big problem that Sir Keir Starmer's got now. We saw him interviewed earlier, not giving anything away about what he's going to do, apart from saying he's going to do something. And looking at the results now, in England at least, he's going to have to do something potentially quite radical. Now, what's that going to be? He's got on the one side the left of his party, union leaders like Len McCluskey, former union leaders, saying you've got to revive socialism, make the case for socialism even stronger than we did under Jeremy Corbyn. And he's got others like Lord Mandelson, who you spoke to earlier, actually saying that's completely the wrong answer. You've got to try and forge a much broader coalition. And as Peter Mandelson said, that the Labour Party is not making a cultural connection with those traditional Labour voters who've switched to the Conservatives. And it's interesting, it's not about left and right anymore, it's about much more than that. And whether Labour have grasped the enormity of what they have to do, whether they hoped just by changing leader that would be enough, these results suggest actually they haven't actually reached the bottom of where they can go. Now, Wales is an exception. They are holding up there, but that is going to be one of the sort of smaller moments of light for them, really, along with London and Sadiq Khan, presumably and very likely to still come home again as mayor. But this is a major problem for Labour that goes far deeper than just the leader. And his party, his parliamentary party, know it. Is he willing, though, to say things that are going to potentially deeply upset many of the party members who put him into that position? And that's the problem he's got over the next few months and years.
Well, one of the testing grounds, without question, Vicky, is the West Midlands, because that really is where Labour's on test. And Elizabeth Clinker, my colleague there at BBC, is in Birmingham. Thanks for joining us, Elizabeth. Give us a guide then. Tell us about this hugely important battleground. And given that Vicky was talking there about Labour and its performance and its challenges, just give us a guide as to what's been going on with Labour in the West Midlands in these elections.
Well, a very challenging night for Labour in the West Midlands. I mean, similar to what we've been hearing from the North East. So we are talking here about those battlegrounds from the 2019 general election, the Red Wall, if you like, across the Black Country, the post-industrial areas. These were seats where the Conservatives made huge gains in the 2019 general election. And I think we're almost seeing a bit of a continuation of that attitude from voters in these council elections. So the big one, really, Dudley, up by thirds, big metropolitan borough. They gained 12 seats, the Conservatives. They took it from no overall control. Conservatives now run Dudley Council, 11 of those seats coming from Labour. And then even if we look into other parts of the urban conurbation at the centre of the West Midlands around Birmingham, places where Labour have held on, they run the councils, they couldn't lose them, they couldn't do anything but win them, given the mathematics this time. But even in places like Wolverhampton and Sandwell, Labour are losing seats to the Conservatives. So somewhere like Sandwell, a few years ago, 60 councillors in Sandwell, 60 councillors, all Labour. They've lost 8 this time to the Conservatives, which, if you then look at what happened in West Bromwich and other places in the general election, it reflects that back. All the MPs in West Bromwich, bar one, went Conservative in 2019, and you're starting to see this reflected in these areas where you would never have people voting there 15 years ago. If you'd said to them, would you consider voting Conservative, it just would have been out of the question. So it really does feel like a continuation of that pattern here on the ground in the West Midlands. And of course, one of the big attention-grabbing elections that's happening in this part of the world is the election for West Midlands Mayor. Andy Street won almost against the odds back in 2017 for the Conservatives, former boss of John Lewis. He now, talking to the two campaigns today, his team very quietly confident, whilst you speak to Labour, Liam Byrne, former minister in Gordon Brown's government, an MP in Birmingham, his team really downcast. Now, they had been actually sort of slightly talking things up over the last few days, saying, oh, those polls that we're hearing, those national polls from London, they're wrong, we're not getting that response on the doorstep. But actually, it's looking like they were wrong, and the electorate here in the West Midlands is turning much more to the Conservatives, and that seems to be something that we've seen it developing over many years now, but it certainly seems to be something that's sort of solidifying.
Clearly, we'll wait for other results as well, including people like Andy Burnham for those big mayoral positions, Elizabeth. Just obviously, the Conservatives will point to Andy Street, and then they'll look at Tees Valley, and we were talking to Ben Houchen earlier, and they will again be making the case that, these positions can be used, if they're used properly, to connect and to effect change. But of course, in order for that to happen, there have to be resources available for them to invest and all the rest of it. So there is a linkage here, however you want to, define it, between a Conservative government and these Conservative mayors in different contexts who are able to say, look, I've got money for this or we've got money for that. And it's interesting, that is a huge challenge for Labour as well in this kind of context.
Yeah, I mean, it's certainly the messaging. Andy Street's campaign for the Conservatives is certainly that is something they've repeated over and over again. I know the right people to talk to. I've got the contacts at number 10. You know, there are a number of big government departments, it's been announced, are moving to the West Midlands. So I think it seems that that maybe is gaining traction with the electorate. The idea that there's some connection between these big jobs, these big metro mayors, being of the same party as the government, and that is something that we have heard repeated again and again. I know how to negotiate. I know these people. I can bring money to the area, and that does seem to be winning people over.
Elizabeth, great to talk to you. Thank you so much, and for taking us through what is a really important battleground in these elections. Thanks very much, Elizabeth Clinker there, and we'll join Kirsty again.
Yeah, we're waiting on the Eastwood result, which may come soon, so we may have to break into the next conversation. But I'm joined by the writer and broadcaster Leslie Riddoch and the columnist for both The Times and The Spectator, Alex Massey. Good evening to you both. First of all, Leslie Riddoch, just reflect on these SNP constituency gains for us. Most recently, of course, Angus Robertson at Edinburgh Central.
Yes, well, here we have an SNP government. This is going for their 4th term. In a proportional parliament where it shouldn't be possible to get an overall majority. And we're seeing gains, which is really quite extraordinary. Edinburgh Central, this was the constituency that Ruth Davidson had. She has now elevated herself to the House of Lords. So that was up for grabs, and it has been grabbed by the SNP, by Angus Robertson, who was ousted from his own constituency in Murray at the last general election as an MP. So he's back into Holyrood. Ayr, equally, held by the Conservatives and now an SNP win. And East Lothian, which has never in the history, well, the short history of the Scottish Parliament, has never not had a Labour MSP. It's been Ian Gray who was the leader for a while, long time. It is now an SNP seat. So those are 3 of the seats. There's 6 seats that are needed if the SNP is to break the bank and manage to get what it did in 2011, which is this supposedly impossible total of 65 seats that means it has a working majority on its own as a party.
So, Alex Massey, by the analysis of Angus Robertson, what done it was Brexit in terms of putting him in Edinburgh Central, where, as Leslie said, he lost Moray in 2017. Brexit has been the big thing that has, as it were, re-energised the SNP vote.
Well, that's obviously part of it. You know, the SNP had to wait quite a long time for a Brexit bounce, but that has arrived. And it is, you know, quite clearly, obviously, a fairly remarkable achievement to be winning another thumping election victory when you've been in power for 14 years. But on the other hand, you know, although this is...
really sorry to interrupt, Alex. We'll be back in a short while. There's a declaration in Llanelli in South Wales. Now, this is normally a very tough contest between Plaid Cymru and Labour. And it's Llanelli, it's not Llangefni, as it was just on there before my Welsh friends tell me. So this has previously been held by Labour and Plaid Cymru. Very narrow majority last time.
I, the undersigned, being the constituency returning officer at the election of a member to serve in the Senedd for Llanelli constituency held on the 6th of May 2021, hereby give notice that the number of votes recorded for each candidate at the said election is as follows. Bia Gareth David, Reform UK, Changing Politics for Good, 672, 672. Buray Jonathan Edward, Welsh Liberal Democrats put recovery first, adfywio yw'r flaenoriaeth, 606. Kayak Shaun Ley, Gwlad, the Welsh Independence Party, Gwlad, Plaid, Annibyniaeth Cymru, 540 a 4, 544. Jones, Helen Mary, Plaid Cymru, the Party of Wales, 8,255. 8,255. Lillyman Howard William, UKIP Scrap the Assembly /Senedd, 722, 722. Najmi Shahana, Independent, 542, 542. Brzeski Steffan George, Welsh Conservative Party candidate, ymgeisydd Plaid Geidwadol Cymru, 4,947, 4,947. Waters, Lee, Welsh Labour, Llafur Cymru, 13,930, 13,930. Yr oedd nifer y papurau pleidleisio
very hefty win for Lee Waters, who had a majority in the hundreds last time over Helen Mary Jones, who was a former member of the Senedd for Llanelli. But Lee Waters, this time a minister in the Welsh Labour government, with a majority of 5,675. So, honestly, in terms of Llanelli and its battles, that's a huge majority for Lee Waters. And we'll take a look at Eastwood in a second, which is coming in from Scotland. But for this Llanelli result, honestly, that is going to be really ringing alarm bells for Plaid Cymru, which has had its own problems in Llanelli in recent years with some reorganisation there, which happened under the leadership of Leanne Wood. So they'll certainly be looking at the result. But Labour will be cock-a-hoop, because that is a really very good result for them in Llanelli. So we'll come back to a little analysis on that a little later on. But let Kirsty take us through the result then in Eastwood, because that's an important one that's just come in as well.
But let's look at that Eastwood result, because this was number 8 on the target for the SNP. It was a three-way marginal. Let's see what happened in Eastwood. And certainly the Conservatives have held that seat. And let's look at that, the vote in more detail, because it's 42% for Conservatives, 36% for the SNP, 16% for Labour. Now let's look at that in terms of the share of the vote. And that's on Conservatives are up 6%. SNP is also up 6%, but Labour is down 15%, which suggests SNP to Con is 0.4%. But the important thing there was the Labour vote was down because they saw Jackson Carlaw, former leader of the Conservatives in the Parliament in Edinburgh, as the more, as it were, as a more important unionist candidate. So again, what it was that we had straightforwardly more tactical voting. So we can see that there, that SNP to Con 0.4 percentage points. So that was a big hope for the SNP, but they haven't managed it. So now over to you, Huw.
Kirsty, thanks for taking us through that. So we were looking at that the result from Llanelli, which is a really stunning win, really, for Welsh Labour against Plaid Cymru. So with that in mind, let me bring in one of the most prominent of Mark Drakeford's ministers, Vaughan Gething, the Health Minister in Wales. Vaughan, thanks for joining us, and I'm just wondering what you made of that result in Llanelli and what's going on so far for you.
Well, it's a really big win for us in Llanelli. It's always been a very tight seat. In fact, no individual has held that seat 2 elections in a row. So we're just not used to seeing that size of majority in the Llanelli seat. So a big result for Welsh Labour. And we're just hearing the Rhun result has come in as well, with a victory for Ystera. So in the 2 direct Labour-Plaid constituency fights, we've succeeded, and by a decent margin. And I think that does show that the leadership we provided through the pandemic has been something that people in Wales have valued and told us about on the doorstep, and they voted for it. There's a slightly different picture in North Wales, where we've lost 1 seat. We may win a seat back on the list. We still need to listen and to understand what's happening there. But if you told me 6 months ago that we'd be on the cusp of getting very near to our result in the last Senedd, potentially even better, I'd have bitten your hand off for that result. So we're delighted, and it does show we've taken nothing for granted, Huw. We fought for every seat and every vote.
Just bear with us, Vaughan, if you would, because and thanks for prompting us on Rhondda, because we've just had the figures in. I'll come back to you very quickly, just so that viewers can see the figures. Elizabeth Williams, Buffy Williams on 12,000 in Rhondda. Leanne Wood, the former Plaid Cymru leader, who took this last time, down to 7,300 votes, the Tories behind there. So the majority is a big majority, again, for Welsh Labour of 5,500 votes. Let's go straight back to Vaughan Gething, just underlining what you were saying there about a very strong performance in those contests against Plaid Cymru.
And it shows a really positive and patriotic campaign we fought here. The big issue on the doorstep was COVID and COVID recovery. Lots of comments about the success of our vaccination programme. And of course, Plaid Cymru chose to vote a presidential campaign largely around Adam Price. And for them, they look on course to finish third now. So there are challenges for Plaid Cymru to address. But even though we're going to be the biggest party in Wales, Welsh Labour certainly won't be taking those votes for granted. And we need to keep on listening, keep on learning, and keep on making choices for the future of Wales that are consistent with our values. And that does mean still listening to what's happening in North Wales and not just celebrating the success we've had so far in the south. There's one big result to come, of course, Huw, and that's in the Vale of Glamorgan, a seat that the Tories were really heavily targeting, and that has real significance for the future of the Senedd. But I'm delighted for all of our candidates and activists, and I'm really, really pleased that people of Wales have responded so positively to our offer in this election.
And what are your party colleagues telling you about the Vale of Glamorgan? Are they making positive noises?
Well, it looks like it's really tight. A few weeks ago, the Tories were sounding very, very positive and were assuming they were going to win by some distance. We always thought this would be incredibly tight. I did the last knock-up of the evening in the cold just before 10 o'clock in Barry. So we took nothing for granted, worked right the way through to the end, and we're looking to see what the actual result is there. You know, Jane Hutts held on to that seat over a long period of years and really had to fight hard. There's been a Tory MP in the Vale of Glamorgan since 2010. So a big result for both Welsh Labour and the Welsh Conservative in the future, but we think it's going to be very tight. And I'm holding out some optimism that Jane Hutt will be returned once again.
Just very quickly, Vaughan, if I may, you know, it's not been possible since 1999 for any party, and Labour in this case certainly, to get 31 seats in the Assembly as it was, the Senedd now. Are we still saying that today? Are you still saying that despite this strong performance of yours, you're not likely to reach 31 seats?
It would be difficult for us to get to 31 seats. We need to look at the lists in North Wales and Mid Wales to see what the results are there. And we will then need to make choices. Being the largest party, we're going to be the largest party. We then need to decide how we can govern in a way that delivers on the promises we've made to the people of Wales and actually does deliver the COVID recovery we know is required in really quite challenging circumstances. But that's what we've had to do for the last 2 decades, Huw, to win elections and then renew our trust and faith with the people of Wales.
Vaughan Gething, it's good to talk to you. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Huw.
And now we can return to the writer and broadcaster Leslie Riddick and the Times and Spectator columnist Alex Salmond. I cut off in his prime, but since I cut you off in your prime, we've had the Eastwood result, Alex Salmond, and a coalescence round the Conservative vote there as the most reliable unionist vote in the area. What do you make of that?
I mean, what this election confirms, obviously, is that Scotland is divided pretty much 50-50 on the national question, on the question of independence. And this is then reflected, obviously, in an election campaign in which the SNP on the constituency part of the election will win something close to 50% of the vote, and unionist parties will win the other 50% of the vote. But obviously that is divided between Conservatives, Labour and Liberals, and so it's only in a relatively small number of constituencies where you see voters coalescing, as you put it, around the most plausible anti-SNP candidate. And that, in that sense, you know, there isn't very much that we are learning that is new in this election. It is a further underlining of the fact that Scotland exists in a sense, a state of sort of nervous equilibrium, if you like. There is a sort of a stalemate here, and years of constitutional trench warfare loom ahead of us.
Well, years of constitutional warfare lie behind us and lie ahead of us as well. And the chances are now, we know, with the way things are going for the SNP, that chances are they will have a majority along with the Greens. We don't know, obviously we haven't had Dumbarton yet. But On the question of a second independence referendum, Nicola Sturgeon says she wants it. Actually, we're going to go straight away. We've got a chance to have an interview with Alex Salmond. We may come back to Alex, but I'm going straight over to Alex Salmond. Alex Salmond, thank you for joining us tonight. By what we're hearing from Alba's performance on the list, it may be that you are not returned to Parliament in Edinburgh to sit as an Alba MSP.
Well, you know, we're still obviously hopeful, Kirsty, because most of the votes are still to be counted on the list. But in terms of what information we have, we think we're going to fall a bit short, perhaps, tomorrow. I mean, we've got some ballot boxes showing Alba at 10%, but there are many others where we're not registering anything like that. What we are doing is registering. I've just looked at a constituency where we beat the Liberal Democrats, for example. So we're making breakthroughs in some places, but in terms of getting the votes necessary to make the parliamentary breakthrough, it may be we fall short. On the other hand, we've got 5,000 members, 20 councillors, 2 members of the Westminster Parliament. That's not that bad in 6 weeks as a political party.
So your 2 MPs at Westminster, what will be the political platform they will stand on? Is it to harry the SNP into an early referendum?
Well, 2 of the arguments we made in this campaign look like, and I mean the final results aren't in yet, Kirsty, but look like they may be proven to be correct. And that is to say we're going to miss out on the supermajority. There'll be an independence majority in the Scots Parliament, but not quite of the extent that I think was possible to do. And therefore it's going to be very important that there are MPs at Westminster, Alba representatives at council level, the Alba membership as a whole, urging forward those who are elected on a platform of independence to get on with it and start explaining independence to the people. And the second thing, and crucially,
let's just be clear on that. Can I just ask you that?
Yet again,
sorry, Alex Salmond,
a million votes in the...
Yeah.
Sorry, on you go. Sorry, Kirsty, there's a delay in the line, so it makes it difficult if you...
There's a delay in the line.
Across.
Yeah, well, what I was going to say, are you going to support Nicola Sturgeon in this? Are you going to be at her back, or are you going to back off now? And are you going to support Nicola Sturgeon? You're very critical of her style of politics heading towards, as you see it, a referendum. You wanted a more direct approach. If I'm right in saying you want to go for an independence referendum, whether or not you get a Section 30. Are you going to now back off and let Nicola Sturgeon lead the party in whichever direction she feels is right towards that independence referendum?
Well, firstly, can I correct you? Alba have been entirely positive about Nicola Sturgeon, and yet we've been urging people in constituencies to vote SNP. Indeed, one of the seats in the North East, which the SNP only won by 700, when there was about 1,200 Alba votes on the list, we probably saved the SNP's bacon in Banff-and-Buck and Coastal by urging people to vote for the SNP at constituency level, as you'd expect, because we're an independent supporting party. But we want to see more urgency in the independence campaign. Now, Nicola has the ball at her feet. She's won a commanding result, whether she gets an overall majority or not. But with winning a big result comes a big responsibility, and the responsibility independent supporters want to see is that case being taken forward. We can take it forward not sometime in the hereafter, but being taken forward in the here and now.
Now, of course, everybody knows that you and Nicola Sturgeon have had your travails. You were quoted in a recent New Yorker article as saying of Nicola Sturgeon, "If I wanted to destroy her, it could have been done." Are you proud of what she's done for the SNP? Well, and would you say that you would never, ever try to destroy her?
Yeah, it's total rubbish, that article, taken completely out of context. I was pointing out that even in the parliamentary inquiries, I refused, despite being invited to call for Nicola Sturgeon's resignation. I may say so, Kirsty, the distinguishing mark of Alba in this campaign is every word we've said about independence and independence leaders has been entirely positive. Yes, we want to see more urgency injected into the independence debate. Now those who have won the election have the responsibility to take matters forward. Alba are in a good position with an activist base, membership, councillors, members of parliament. We'll be there as the guardians of the independence cause and arguing strongly that it must be taken forward. Look, there's 2 points of view in Scotland in the independence camp. Some people believe that you should soft pedal on independence in order to kind of sneak it past people. I believe that the way to increase independent support, as was demonstrated in 2014, is to openly advocate independence and to make sure you have answers to the very real pertinent questions about currency, about Europe, about independence and economic revival, about independence in the modern era. That is not the era of 2014, but the changed world we live in now. And ALAPA will be advocating an independence case that addresses that, addresses 2021 and addresses the future. And therefore, while we are entirely supportive of Nicola putting forward the independence case, understandably, ALAPA will be arguing that case should be put forward with alacrity and urgency.
And just for the record, that New Yorker quote, that was a lie, you're saying?
No, what I'm saying is it was taken totally out of context, and what I told the journalist weeks and weeks ago on the phone, I pointed out to him that what I'd said at the Parliamentary Committee, despite being asked to by unionist MSPs, I refused to call for Nicola's resignation. That's the point I was making in the New Yorker article, and the point I'm making to you, Kirsty, is in this campaign, ALAPA have been entirely positive, not just myself as party leader, but our entire campaign has been positive about Scottish independence, about lifting the horizons in terms of looking at the future of Scotland, which undoubtedly, in my estimation, is independence. That's why I think ALAPA will be well set to play a significant role in Scottish politics as we move into that exciting prospect.
Thank you very much, Alex Salmond. I'd like to go straight back now to Leslie Riddoch and Alex Massey. Leslie Riddoch, first of all, what did you make of that interview that Alex Salmond has just given?
Well, I thought it was kind of a very generous one, given the amount of effort and political capital that's been used up by Alex and lots of independent supporters in trying to get ALAPA off the ground. I mean, of course, we don't know because the list section of the seats hasn't been counted yet, but as he's conceding, in quite a number of places, there's just not enough of a groundswell to expect there to be very many elected at all. I think what ALAPA have done is they've opened up people's thinking a lot about the second vote that they have in Scotland. But strangely, the beneficiaries of that could be a different party entirely, the Greens, partly because they've also been included in BBC and STV debates, and they've done extremely well. A very deft combination of a co-leadership between Lorna Slater and Patrick Harvey. A lot of younger people very, very concerned about the environment. COP26 coming up in Scotland. And all of that now is fronted by the Greens for the first time, making a really clear commitment to an independence referendum themselves. So the combination is pretty powerful, maybe more powerful with more media exposure than ALPA.
I just want to give the last word here to Alex Massey, looking ahead to Boris Johnson's implacable opposition to an independence referendum. Is that, do you think, a tenable position if the SNP plus Greens are going again explicitly in their manifestos as parties for Scottish independence?
Well, there's a pro-independence majority in the old Scottish Parliament, and there's going to be a pro-independence majority in the new one. But the old Parliament couldn't deliver or force a referendum, and it's not clear to me that the new one can either, despite those manifesto commitments. The number the people that matter here are not Boris Johnson, actually, it's the people of Scotland. And although they're voting for SNP and perhaps Green candidates in this election, it remains the case that if you actually ask people, do you want a referendum in the next 2 years? Only 28% of people say they do. Do you want one in the next 5 years? And that figure goes up to around 45%. Now, those are not the circumstances, it seems to me, in which it would be prudent or sensible or desirable to have a second independence referendum. It may be that at present people like the idea of independence more in theory than they do in practice. But clearly, the argument for a referendum has a degree of moral authority or moral weight behind it. And so it is going to become difficult the longer the UK says no to it, or the people of Scotland say no to it, the harder that line becomes to sustain. And so now is not the time, will do for the time being, but it isn't a long-term answer to the problems, the very real problems that unionism has.
Alex Massey, Leslie Rose, thanks so much for joining us.
We were talking earlier about the result in Eastwood, and Sir John Curtis has just passed this note on to me saying that the successful Conservative defence of Eastwood, says John, significantly reduces the SNP's chances of winning an overall majority. and this appeared to be among the more likely places where the SNP might win one of the key opposition marginal seats that were left to declare. Now, the victor in Eastwood is the Conservative Jackson Carlaw, former Conservative leader. Ms Carlaw, it's great to have you with us, and congratulations on your re-election.
Thank you very much.
So can I just take you back to the campaign, if I may, which obviously was successful from your point of view. And can you just talk us through the factors in that campaign which you thought were the most telling ones, which produced this victory for you?
Well, I'm obviously delighted with the result. I mean, my majority's up, my vote's up, the vote share for the Conservative Party is up. And I think it would be fair to say that the issue of the future of Scotland and the need for us now to focus entirely on the recovery from the pandemic and not to put ourselves through all the division and heartache of another introspective long conversation and then referendum about the future of Scotland and the Union was very, very much one of the things that people said to me from various parties who were voting to support me in this election that they had decided was the key issue that had drawn them to support me this time round.
I'm just looking at the tally at the moment, and Conservatives in Scotland, in the Parliament there, on 3, down 2. Where do you think, I know it's a ridiculous question in some ways, but I'm just really wanting to draw on your intelligence from, you know, your experience on the campaign trail. Where do you think you'll end up? What is your sense of the Conservative performance in this campaign?
Well, I mean, I actually had a feeling at points that we might end up with a parliament, a new parliament, which doesn't look that wholly different to the one that was there before. So I would expect the Conservative Party still to be the largest party in opposition. What the final number will be, I don't know. And I hope and believe that we can still deny the SNP that majority that would allow them to railroad legislation through what was a parliament that was always designed not to be a parliament with a government with a majority, but a parliament in which any leading party would have to reach out to get progress on all the various issues. And I think if we can do that, then actually we can make some productive progress for the people of Scotland.
But surely what's likely to happen, I mean, obviously I'd like your view on it, is that the SNP will do what it's done before and, you know, patch up with the Greens or possibly someone else to put through the programme, and in which case it's difficult to see what you as Scottish Conservatives can do in that context.
Well, we'll rigorously oppose. I mean, I think one of the things that is undoubtedly true is that the last year has been dominated by the pandemic and the attention of us all on it. It's interesting that actually before we went into that pandemic, the SNP was beginning to struggle slightly in opinion polls because I think there was a much greater recognition that on nearly every level and in every public service, we were in a worse position than we'd been 12 months before. Now, as we move out of the pandemic, as we actually start to concentrate on ensuring that we've got the jobs, that the economy is recovering, that we start to look again at getting the cancer waiting times that have obviously lengthened as a result of the pandemic, the focus of everybody will be on the successful delivery of the domestic agenda in Scotland. And if the SNP don't deliver on that, we will be standing there rigorously opposing them. And on the back of a manifesto, which opinion polls actually showed was the most popular of the manifestos, when people were asked to read it without knowing whose it was, we have got a detailed policy prospectus, which will be the basis of the opposition, constructive opposition that we offer, with a view to, in due course, ensuring that the SNP are now in their final term of office and that Scotland, in due course, has an alternative government and an alternative future.
During the campaign, Mr Carlaw, Boris Johnson made several visits to Wales. As I understand it, he made not a single visit to Scotland. You'll correct me if I'm wrong. Is that because he didn't want to, or is that because he's an embarrassment to you in Scotland?
Well, you know, I heard a lot about this, but, you know, I think David Cameron only came once to the Scottish election campaign in 2016. The Prime Minister's not on the ballot. And I mean, David Cameron came and there wasn't a pandemic. So actually, I wasn't at all surprised that the Prime Minister wasn't in Scotland on this occasion. He comes up as head of the government, but this would have been purely a visit for party political purposes. And I think he made the correct decision. But this is a Scottish election for a Scottish Parliament with our Scottish leader, Douglas Ross, who I'm looking forward very much now to getting behind at Holyrood. That's what's important. We'll work closely with the Prime Prime Minister, of course, for the betterment of Scotland, because so much of the recovery from the pandemic for our economy depends on our working closely with the Chancellor, Rishi Sunak, and also with the Prime Minister. But I think the fact that he wasn't here during the election is something people like to make a great issue of. I don't think it had any part at all in the actual delivery of the campaign, our campaign message, or the result that we'll achieve.
Mr. Carlaw, good to talk to you. Thank you.
And now we can be joined by the woman of the moment, Jackie Baillie, the Deputy Leader of the Scottish Labour Party, who is in Dumbarton, which is the most marginal constituency in Scotland, 109 votes in it, and the SNP at your heels. Jackie Baillie, this is a long wait for you to get this result. And you know, of course, this is a critical result tonight for you, obviously, but also it would be an incredible, important result for the SNP. What is it looking like?
Well, I hate to disappoint you, but, you know, it is too close to call. I can't speculate on what the outcome will be. You know, I do always say we like a bit of drama in Dumbarton constituency. It was 109 last time. It's very close again this time.
By your maths or by eagle eyes, is it, do you think, closer than 109?
I have genuinely no idea. Some of the people, you know, looking around and sampling the votes suggest it might be even closer, but who knows, you know, so I'm not going to speculate further. But you know, the nice thing about this campaign, irrespective of the result, is actually the really positive conversations we've had with people at the doors. You know, suddenly Labour now has not just permission to speak, but to actually be heard. And we had great discussions with people about their experience of the pandemic, what they want to see Parliament do, what they want to see a group of Labour MSPs in the Parliament do, which is to prioritise recovery, to talk about jobs and the economy, to get our NHS back on track, and to also make sure that our children who have been out of school for the best part of a year have the ability to catch up and seize the opportunities they would otherwise have missed.
But the problem for Labour is you're not making headway in the constituencies. You know, there are no great spectacular victories here. And you're in exactly the same position, or potentially in the same position as you have been for the last 4 years. And which brings me on to the possibility of an independence referendum. We're looking now at a probable SNP, perhaps with Green majority in the Scottish Parliament. We know that Nicola Sturgeon is focused on the pandemic, she says, but looking ahead to an independence referendum in the first part of the next Parliament. What is Labour's position going to be on this? Because if you're going to stand in the way of an independence referendum, are you going to stand shoulder to shoulder with Boris Johnson on this?
Look, we've made it perfectly clear in our manifesto that we are against independence. We don't think the time is right for an independence referendum. You know, I'm old enough to remember the global recession in 2008. Well, let me just finish the point, because in 2008 we had a global recession that was not as bad in terms of impact on the economy and jobs as the pandemic has been. There are people still in furlough who are worried about whether they will have a job when they come out of furlough. We haven't seen the full impact of the pandemic yet. And if it took 10 years to recover from the global recession, it's going to take a while to recover from the pandemic. And we have said very clearly our focus should be on that. It should be on recovery, not referendums. And actually that was what people were saying to me on the doorstep as well.
If there is a majority in the Scottish Parliament for the idea of an independence referendum, would you stand on a platform with Conservatives, other unionists after all, a unionist alliance, standing against the Nationalists and the Greens against an independence referendum? Is that what you would do? Would there be a Better Together campaign this time round, would there? Or what would happen?
No, to be honest, we've covered this ground in a previous interview, and I'm very clear that, you know, the Labour Party's position is that we don't want to see a referendum because we think the recovery is more important. At the end of the day, the Parliament can pass, you know, resolutions and motions, but the reality is the responsibility lies with the UK government. Of course, Scotland has the right to choose. We would never deny that. But actually, the priority, I believe, is recovery from the pandemic, nothing else.
Jackie Baillie, your result, I gather, will come in before the end of the night at least. Thank you so much for joining us.
And we'll certainly be there for that, Kirsty. It's an interesting one, to say the least. We're going to take a pause for the news in just a second. We'll be back to talk a little more about the SNP's remaining targets with Reeta. We'll talk to John Curtis about how he sees the overall share, the projected national share, which we'll explain to you in a second. That's coming up too. And we'll be talking to one of the senior ministers in Boris Johnson's government. So all of that coming up after Shaun gives us the latest news.
Huw, thank you very much. Good evening. Election results have been coming in throughout the day across England, Scotland and Wales. The Conservatives are celebrating a major victory in the Hartlepool-Westminster by-election, winning the seat for the first time in more than 60 years. In Scotland, results in the Parliament elections are still coming in. The SNP is hoping to secure an outright majority and further its calls for another independence referendum. Results so far suggest it could be incredibly close. Damien Grammaticus has more.
A Tory triumph, not the balloon, that wasn't the best likeness. But for Boris Johnson, this was another Labour stronghold demolished. Jill Mortimer is the first Conservative MP to represent Hartlepool in 57 years.
If there's a lesson out of this whole election campaign, the whole local election campaign across the whole of the UK, it's that the public want politicians to get on with focusing on their needs and their priorities.
And the region delivered another bitter blow for Labour. Its candidate for Tees Valley Mayor was soundly beaten too. The Conservative incumbent, Ben Houchen, returned with more than 70% of the vote. In council elections, Conservatives took control of Nuneaton and Bedworth in the West Midlands and Basildon in Essex. Glum Labour faces as Harlow in Essex went to the Tories and Dudley in the West Midlands too.
Well, I'm bitterly disappointed in the results, and I take full responsibility for the results, and I will take full responsibility for fixing things.
The Greens have been picking up seats here from Labour in Sheffield.
Well done, fantastic.
The Liberal Democrats from the Conservatives in Cambridgeshire. In the Welsh Parliament election, Labour has lost the Vale of Clwyd to the Conservatives, but won Rhondda from Plaid Cymru. Scotland's Parliament is where the result could be the most consequential.
Well done.
The SNP has taken Ayr and Edinburgh Central. The question here, can Nicola Sturgeon get an overall majority? If so, how soon might she push for independence?
Extremely happy and extremely confident that we are on track in the SNP for a fourth consecutive election victory and to have the ability to form a government again. And that's an extraordinary achievement for any political party.
North and south of the border, the final shape of things will only be clear over the weekend. But what happens in Scotland could take some of the wind out of Boris Johnson's celebrations. Damien Grammaticus, BBC News.
In other news tonight, the international travel ban for England will start to be slowly lifted in 10 days' time. Portugal, Israel and Gibraltar are on a list of just 12 green countries that you'll be able to travel to without quarantining on your return home. Meanwhile, Turkey has been added to the red list for travel, so thousands of fans with tickets for the Manchester City-Chelsea Champions League final there at the end of the month have been told not to go. Here's our transport correspondent, Caroline Davis.
The beaches of Portugal are one step closer. The green list of countries is out. From the 17th of May, anyone travelling from any of these 12 countries and territories won't need to quarantine when they arrive in England. But that doesn't mean that all of these countries will welcome tourists from the 17th of May. Some, like Australia and New Zealand, will not.
There are only 12 countries and territories on this list. Many passengers will be very disappointed by that, as will the industry. Why are there so few?
We are having to be cautious about this initially. We don't want to overturn all the brilliant work of, frankly, the British people in taking these vaccines and staying at home and all of that pain. And so we can't do anything to put that at risk.
3 countries have also been added to the red list from 4 a.m. on Wednesday, including Turkey, where the Champions League final is due to take place later this month. The government has confirmed talks are happening to bring it to the UK and said fans shouldn't travel there. There was relief in Portugal. Miguel Campina runs a restaurant in the Algarve.
Well, this is an absolutely amazing news, and we must say, on behalf of the Algarve in Portugal, we must say thank you.
But with the virus still circulating, some think reopening international travel is still too great a risk.
Especially the poor nations have not even got going with their vaccination program. So we've got to get that program going, suppress the infections before we say, look, international travel is now considerably safer.
More countries will be added or removed from the list every 3 weeks, and the government say those fully vaccinated will be able to show their status on the NHS app from the 17th of May. For now, travel to most of the world is still not possible, but more is promised, just over the horizon. Caroline Davis, BBC News.
The latest figures show 2,490 people with infections have been reported in the last 24-hour period to Friday. That means, on average, about 2,060 new cases per day over the last week. 15 deaths were reported in the 24 hours to Friday. That's people who tested positive for COVID-19 in the 28 days before they died. 12 deaths on average were announced every day in the past week. 127,598 people have now died across the UK during the pandemic so far. As regards vaccinations, more than 35 million people have now received at least one jab of COVID. More than 16.5 million people are now fully vaccinated. Adults under the age of 40 will be offered an alternative to the Oxford AstraZeneca vaccine because of concern over rare blood clots. The under 30s were already being offered a different jab. Our medical editor Fergus Walsh explains.
The Oxford AstraZeneca vaccine is the main workhorse of the NHS immunisation campaign and highly effective at preventing serious COVID infection. But unlike the Pfizer and Moderna jabs, it's been linked to a rare clotting disorder. 28.5 million doses of the Oxford AstraZeneca vaccine have been given in the UK up to the last week of April. There have been 242 cases of rare blood clots combined with low platelet levels, almost all after the first shot. The overall incidence is 1 in 100,000 doses, but the risks are higher for those in their 30s, where it rises to 1 in 60,000 doses. There have been 49 deaths in total. That's 2 deaths per 1 million doses of vaccine. Falling infection rates means the threat to the under 40s from COVID is now so small that the potential risk from the AstraZeneca vaccine to this age group looms larger. So where possible, they'll be given a different jab.
We offer this advice, which places a high priority on safety in the hope that it will further increase vaccine confidence so that those of us who are being offered a vaccine in the coming weeks can feel more confident and feel more able to step forward, accept the offer of a vaccine.
The NHS is still on target to offer every adult a first dose by the end of July, and vaccines remain the key to ending the pandemic.
They have already saved over 10,000 British lives. But actually the greater value of these vaccines is the lives they will save in the future by keeping the disease under long-term control. And that is why we must finish the job.
The under 40s play a key role in transmission of coronavirus, so vaccination will protect them in any third wave and protect the vulnerable even more. Fergus Walsh, BBC News.
Police are appealing to the public to help to identify a man who was seen close to where the police community support officer Julia James was killed. They released a photograph taken in Kent the day after the 53-year-old died. She was found dead in Ackhold Wood near her home 10 days ago. Post-mortem revealed she died from significant head injuries. Helena Wilkinson reports.
Who is this man? Detectives desperately need to know. They say he could be the key to unlocking what happened to Julia James.
Somebody knows who that man is. We desperately need you to make contact with us and help us identify who that person is. If that person is watching, please make contact with us. We believe that you have crucial information.
The man in the image that police have released today was spotted somewhere along this country lane in Aylsham last Wednesday, the day after the body of Julia James was discovered. This is an area that's not far from the crime scene. Where the photograph came from or who took it police won't say. Julia James had been walking her dog when she was attacked. Just a few hundred yards from her home, she suffered significant head injuries. Her husband posted this photograph of them both, saying how much he missed her. A reward of up to £10,000 has been offered by Crime Stoppers for information leading to a conviction in this case. Officers from forces across the country have now been asked to support Kent Police on what continues to be a challenging case for them. On the 10th day of this investigation, they're hoping they're getting closer to the breakthrough they need. Helena Wilkinson, BBC News, Aylsham in Kent.
Election results, of course, will keep coming in over the course of the weekend. For live coverage of the results and expert analysis on what they mean, do visit our website, or, of course, you can use the BBC News app. Now back to elections 2021.
Yes, Kirsty and I welcome you back to the BBC's election coverage. It's 8:20, and we've had quite a few results in. Not all of them by any means, and we'll both be here tomorrow as well, looking at more results as they come in, and we can analyse them. But we've reached quite an important moment in the coverage, because those of you who are connoisseurs of the BBC's coverage will know that at a certain point, Sir John Curtis and his team of expert number crunchers come up with what we call the projected national share of the vote. Now, I'm going to try to explain it, but John will come in and no doubt correct me if I'm wrong. Basically, it is a projected national share. What would the parties have got in terms of a projected share had there been a general election today and, crucially, had people voted in the same way? Now, clearly, that is a very big qualification because people often vote very differently in local or regional and national elections. But that's what it's about, is to give you a sense of, a different sense of the kind of relative performance of the parties. Let's have a look at the figures before we talk to John. And the projected national share is as follows. The Conservatives on 36%, Labour on 29%, that's 7 points adrift. The Lib Dems on 17, which obviously is far higher than they've been doing on opinion polls to date, and that is to do with their local election performance. The others on 18%. So 36 to the Tories and 29 to Labour, 17 to the Lib Dems and 18% to the others. Let's bring in Sir John. And first of all, John, are you happy with my definition of the PNS?
Yeah, very good, Huw. I think, 9 out of 10 at least. The crucial point is we're trying to give you an indication of how the way in which people behave, crucially, in the English local elections. This is just based on the English local elections. It doesn't include the London mayoralty. It doesn't include Scotland. It doesn't include Wales. It's saying, given the pattern of votings in the English local elections, then what might this translate if this had been a general election? Yeah.
So talk us through the figures and what you make of them.
OK, so you'll see that there is a 7-point Conservative lead over Labour. That is very much in line with what the recent opinion polls have been telling us. I reckon on average at the moment, the opinion polls are putting the Conservatives 6 points ahead, while here we've got it 7 points ahead. Point two, as you've already said, the Liberal Democrats are doing much better in this projection than they're doing in the current polls, and the current polls are only running at about 7%. But the truth is, Liberal Democrats always do better in local elections. And if you compare, and this is really the point of this exercise, is to enable you to compare these local elections with previous local elections. Now, by that standard, the Liberal Democrats, it's slightly better than 2016 and 2018, not as good as 2019. In other words, it's pretty much par for the course for the Liberal Democrats. Their pavement politics is still alive, but this isn't a sign of any significant recovery. Let me then go back to Conservative and Labour. You will remember throughout the many hours that we've been broadcasting, we've been constantly reminding people that there were two baselines for the English local elections. One was 2016, when Conservative and Labour were roughly neck and neck, and the other was 2017, when the Conservatives were perhaps as much as 9-10 points ahead in the projected national share, and even more so in the polls. Well, you can now see why, Indeed, the Conservatives have been making net gains, but they've been making those net gains primarily on the basis of what's happened in the 2016 councils, because there's a very clear swing from Labour to the Conservatives. But equally, however, this result is not quite so good for the Conservatives as the one in 2017, and so therefore we've been seeing there occasionally some gains by Labour to the Conservatives. There's then one other crucial point I would make. You will remember in the dim and distant hours of this morning, many a Labour politician rushing to judgment on the basis of Hartlepool and a relatively small amount of information of local election results to say that the Labour Party was in this or that dire state and coming up with this or that alternative strategy to that being pursued by Sir Keir Starmer. At this point, I think we should point out that at 7 points, yes, you don't expect an opposition to be 7 points behind in the polls at this stage of the election cycle. But it is less than the 12-point lead that the Conservatives had in the 2019 general election. And to that extent, at least, it would be incorrect to say the Labour Party has made no progress at all relative to the Conservatives, albeit you might want to feel that it's the progress of a snail rather than that of a hare. I think there's still plenty of questions for the Labour Party to address about this result, but I think we should at least give credit where credit is due. Labour's made some progress. It's just got an awful lot more further to go.
It's interesting saying that, John, isn't it? You're saying Labour has made some progress, and indeed you've explained how, and we've seen some of it. And yet, when we had the statement from the leader, Sir Keir Starmer, earlier today, that was ringing lots of alarm bells for people, because he seemed to be saying, well, look, we accept we're in trouble here. We could, we really need to take some radical action, or we are not going to reconnect at a level which can bring that gap down to nil and then bring it up again over and above the Tories. So the signals from Labour themselves, from the leadership, are rather alarmist on that point.
Sure, because, of course, behind those overall grand figures is the other thing that we've been saying throughout the last 12 hours, which is that Labour have been doing a lot worse compared with 2016 and 2017 in the most Leave parts of England and doing relatively well in the most Remain parts. Now, you might say, well, swings and roundabouts. However, the Labour Party regards the downside of that contrast with greater concern than it does accept the merits of the upside. That is, the Labour Party believes that it has to reconnect with Leave voters and thus its traditional working class base in order to have the chance of winning a general election. Now, in truth, that is a strategy, which if you can execute it, but logically it's not the only strategy. One strategy, to be honest, quite simply, is that you try to gain votes amongst both Remain and Leave voters. You get your vote to rise. And if you do that, you might still have many more Remain voters supporting you than Leave voting supporting you. You maybe start winning constituencies you wouldn't normally expect to win and not winning other constituencies you normally did win, but you might still get yourself up to a winning position. That's one alternative strategy. In other words, you just accept that you're more popular amongst Remain voters. Don't particularly try to prioritise Leave voters. You just try to come up with an overall message that makes the Labour Party more popular amongst both groups. The other potential strategy is to accept that you are no longer a working class party that's particularly popular amongst working class voters, that Boris Johnson perhaps is going to be very difficult to beat in that respect, and that therefore the party should be trying to consolidate its position amongst more Remain inclined voters, a constituency of people who, even with the Liberal Democrats' relatively weak position in the polls at the moment, Labour is still sharing with the Liberal Democrats and in Scotland the SNP in a way that the Conservatives are not sharing the Leave voters with everybody else. Now, logically, these are all possible ways of trying to deal with Labour's problem. Some of them, however, require the Labour Party to rethink what it's about as a party. And that, I think, you're finding difficult. I think the second thing that came out of this morning, apart from Peter Mandelson clearly understands that Labour's problem is not necessarily simply because it's too left-wing or too right-wing, but that actually Boris Johnson has won over Leave voters because of what Peter Mandelson called the cultural divide. On the other hand, however, there's still clearly many people inside the Labour Party who are wanting to use these results to fight the battle between left and right. Well, the message that both of those sides need to take on board is that actually whether somebody is on the left or on the right matters less to whether or not they're going to vote for the Labour Party now than it traditionally did. That cultural divide is now just as important. So if, however Labour Party wishes to recover, it's got to think about how it's going to deal with the cultural divide as well as deciding where it stands on the left-right spectrum.
John, just stay with us a second. Can we just have a look at Dumbarton just to see what's going on there, so that we can make a bit of a judgment here? So they're kind of gathering, and obviously it seems to me that, this is just going by my experience of these counts, they're gathering and they're walking up. I think we're going to get a declaration here very soon. So we're just going to hopefully stay with it. They're just going to check in the room.
I think we should say, Huw, that if the Labour Party manage to hang on to Dumbarton, then the SNP's chances of getting overall majority, well, they don't quite disappear. But given also their failure to pick up Eastwood, they do take another substantial fall in the likelihood of that happening. So this is potentially a pretty crucial declaration.
John, thanks. We're just on these images. I think the agents and the staff are just gathering for a quick chat before the declaration comes. I'm grateful to Nadhim Zahawi, the Conservative MP and the Vaccine Deployment Minister, for waiting so graciously to talk to us. Nadhim, thank you very much and welcome. So if that result comes in Dumbarton, forgive me, I'll just cut off to it, so and then I'll come back to you. So first of all, your broad thoughts on how the Conservative Party's done?
Well, I think if you look at the results in Nuneaton and Bedworth, and Nuneaton is always, and John Curtis will tell you this, a bellwether in general elections as to which way Nuneaton swings is where the country effectively goes and delivers the mandate to that particular party. The result there, the result in Harlow, in Basildon, in Sheffield as well, and of course Ben Houchen in the northeast and Hartlepool. I think voters understood the enormity of the task of the pandemic. I don't think they liked where Labour was on this, or Keir Starmer specifically on this issue. I think there were too many sort of political point-scoring moments for him, which bothered them. I think they didn't like that there were no policies from Labour. I think John McDonnell actually, I don't agree regularly with John McDonnell, but in this case, Keir did a big sit-down interview with one of your colleagues, Robert Peston, on another channel. Not a single policy, kept going about wallpaper and curtains. And I actually said that night, it could be curtains for Keir if he's not careful. So the voters want to know what you're going to do for them, and are you on their side? And I think Boris Johnson and his team, and the whether it's the mayoral candidates or our local councillors or our brilliant candidate, Jill Mortimer in Hartlepool, delivered a set of policies about jobs and the recovery from the pandemic, about investment in offshore wind, in £12 billion going into renewables, 640 billion going into the economy in infrastructure, about the Kickstart scheme for young people and jobs, which parents and grandparents worry about. So I think we had a compelling story, but we've got to now really focus and deliver all of that in the coming years, because I think that is what people are looking for us to do, and none better than Boris Johnson, because he has that ability, both when he was Mayor of London, but now as Prime Minister, in the way he's actually demonstrated with the vaccine programme, both in terms of supply and deployment. He has that sort of obsessive laser-like focus on delivery, and that will make all the difference.
Minister, there'll be viewers watching thinking, OK, he went out on the campaign trail, we saw lots of him. He went to Wales, certainly, because I noted some of those visits. This compelling story, though, he didn't want to take to Scotland because he didn't go there. So why was that?
Well, he actually did, Huw. He went to visit the Valneva factory, if you recall, which is making one of our vaccines. A big investment we've made. It's a French company that's invested in a big manufacturing facility. In fact, we, the government, have also further invested and expanded that facility. And Boris visited there, and at the time, I think Nicola Sturgeon was sort of saying he really shouldn't be here. He was absolutely right to be there. The Scottish team and Douglas have done, I think, a tremendous job to focus this election on, what are we going to do to make sure children in Scotland catch up on their education? The education system used to be the pride of the world.
OK, Minister, can I just stop you for a second? I'm sorry. Dumbarton.
Parliament election held on the 6th of May 2021 hereby give notice that the total number of ballot papers counted in the Dumbarton constituency is 38,565. The electorate was 56,296. The turnout is 68.5%. The total number of votes cast for each candidate in this constituency is as follows. Jackie Baillie, Scottish Labour Party, 17,825. Maurice Corrie, Scottish Conservatives and Unionist Party, 3,205. Andy Foxall, Scottish Liberal Democrats, 676. Tony Giuliano, Scottish National Party, SNP, 16,342. James Morrison, Independent, 183. Andrew Joseph Muir, Independent, 94. Jonathan Rainey, Scottish Libertarian Party, 134, and the total number of rejected votes was 106. The reason for the rejections are as follows. Want of an official mark, 1. Voting for more than one candidate, 18.
SNP's #1 target, Dumbarton, has not fallen to them. In fact, Jackie Baillie, the deputy leader of the Labour group at the Scottish Parliament, has increased her majority. Remember, she had a majority of 109, so let's go through now and look at the votes cast. So there we have Jackie Baillie on 17,826. and the SNP Tony Quigliani 16,342. Let's look at how that share, the change in the share of the vote there, because it looks as if, as we can see there, Labour put on 6 percentage points, the SNP dropped 3, the Conservatives dropped 6, and the Liberal Democrats dropped 2. The swing from SNP to Labour is 1.8%, but look at that switch between the Conservatives and Labour, because what has happened here is that Jackie Baillie, long-standing member of the Scottish Parliament since 1999, has added to her tally, taking Conservative votes, tactical voting, because she is seen in that area as the best defender of the Union. We are joined now by Andrew Wilson, who wrote the Gross Sustainability Report on Scotland, former MSP. Andrew Wilson, what do you make of that? That was the #1 target. That's a big blow for you.
Well, it's a great result for Jackie, so congratulations to her.
And a lot of personal vote for her as well.
I'm sure of it. She's been in this Parliament since its beginning and is a great public servant. Can't win every seat. We've won 3 seats today already. It looks like the SNP's on course for a historic 4th term, which is unprecedented in this Parliament. It looks likely that there'll be a pro-independence majority tomorrow, but we'll need to wait and see. So I think it's been across the country, tactical voting. In some areas, the swing's been very inconsistent. So, this will happen. But, congratulations to Jackie.
Yes.
I don't think it's going to be material to the outcome of the election.
No, but it's interesting because actually talking about lending votes, it means that Labour supporters are prepared to hand their vote over to the Tories and vice versa, in order to make some kind of strong unionist stance here. So you're looking at probably this majority either most likely with the Greens rather than on your own. But it's interesting because it's a 4th term. And by any standard, for a party to reach a 4th term with such, on this showing, good showing, is by no means surely a disappointment for the Nationalists.
Quite the opposite. It's an amazing so far, an amazing outcome for a 4th term government. Not only that, but with the Greens having in their manifesto a commitment to a referendum, as do the SNP, you're seeing, after a period of remarkable, how to put it, shenanigans in Scottish politics, the chaos of the last few months.
I'm going to keep you there. I just want a quick word to John Curtis now. Let's be quite clear, John. Do you think there is a pathway to outright victory for the SNP there, or is it more likely to be SNP plus Green?
Well, there still is a pathway to an overall majority, Kirsty, but it's a very, very narrow one. There are a couple of constituencies left. Conservative-held constituencies, Galloway and Aberdeenshire West, that SNP might just pick up, but to be honest, on the basis of the results so far, we think it's less than likely. And then they might just pick up a list seat in the Highlands and Islands. And if all of that happened, that might still take them to 65. But I think, as Andrew Wilson is beginning to acknowledge, it's now the most probable outcome is indeed that the SNP is going to be 1 or 2 seats short. And we are therefore looking at an SNP Green majority for a referendum rather than the SNP on their own. I think 2 things might flow from that. First is that the UK government will feel more emboldened to say no to the request that is bound to happen at some point from the new Parliament. But secondly, it may actually speed up the constitutional clash. One suspects that some people inside the SNP will regard this as a disappointment, and some of them at least will argue that one reason for this is that Ms Sturgeon has not been pursuing the independence project and the independence referendum strongly enough. So Ms Sturgeon, I think, is going to be in a weaker position vis-à-vis her party, and that will give her less room for manoeuvre in terms of trying to play the timing of the referendum or the referendum request long rather than short. So Ms Sturgeon, because she's in a weaker position, might now want to push for the referendum rather more strongly. But at the same time, Boris Johnson may now feel somewhat more emboldened to try and put her off.
Well, before I put that back to Andrew Wilson, what about the inverse of that? What Alex Massey was saying is if the opinion polls, if you were to say to people right now in Scotland they wanted an independence referendum, the result of that opinion poll would be 29% do. If you were to wait, say, 5 to 10 years, it would be 45%. What about the possibility that Nicola Sturgeon does not want the referendum right now because she needs to build her case again, and what therefore Boris Johnson might do is swoop in counterintuitively and say, right, you want a referendum, have it, but you have to have it now?
Okay, well, 2 points to make. I mean, on that particular strategy, of course, it would mean a complete 180-degree turn from the claim of the Conservative Party during this election. It would be, I think, one of the most remarkable U-turns in British politics if he were suddenly to go down that path.
Boris Johnson.
Secondly,
we're talking about Boris Johnson,
John. Extraordinary gamble. We are talking about a country that's pretty much divided down the middle on the merits of independence. It's going to be a gamble where we are at the moment. It's going to be a gamble for both sides if a referendum is ever held, and Mr. Johnson would be facing the possibility that he would actually lose. So. Some pretty obvious downside risks in pursuing that. One is you arguably undermine the credibility of your central message in the election campaign that's just been concluded. And secondly, you're bringing on a contest which you're by no means guaranteed to win.
Andrew Wilson, what's your analysis of that, just what John was saying there?
Well, I mean, the first thing to say, there'll be literally no one in the SNP will be disappointed with this result today and tomorrow on course for what's happening. The second thing is I've never said at any point that I thought an overall SNP majority was likely, because there's not a country on the planet where there's a PR system where one party has an overall majority.
But you did in 2011.
Did it in very different circumstances then, with votes coming from unionists and others for the SNP, a different time. If we're going to do this, if Scotland is going to choose independence, the UK government needs to decide, is the UK held together by force of law, or is it held together by consent and democracy? I think this country has to be built on democracy, and most people agree. The second point is, if Scotland is going to do this, we need to do it in a way that's the opposite, the antithesis of the antidote to Brexit. We need a prospectus that is clear about all the trade-offs, what the transition looks like. That needs set out in advance. This needs done in an orderly fashion when people are ready.
Interesting, I don't know if you heard the Alex Salmond interview there, but he seemed to be he wasn't suggesting that Nicola Sturgeon was backsliding, but he seemed to be indicating that actually it wanted to re-energise the move towards an independence referendum vote. And we know from Alex Salmond in the past, as he has said, no need to wait for Section 30 from Boris Johnson. If you've got the consent of the Parliament, you can just go for that. Nicola Sturgeon has been pretty implacably opposed to that.
Well, either you get a Section 30, that would be the orderly way to do it, or that the Scottish Parliament can legislate for it and it's up to Boris Johnson to take it to the courts. The orderly thing to do is to recognise people's right to self-determine. Every Prime Minister since I was born held to that position. Boris Johnson's different. We know Boris Johnson's different. If it's going to be done, it needs to be done in an orderly way. The opposite of Brexit, a clear white paper setting out all the issues: currency, deficit, border. You know, we're how many years after the Brexit vote? We still don't really know what the border settlement will be and will evolve between us and Northern Ireland at the moment. So that's how not to do it. Scotland's going to do it differently.
Andrew, thank you very much indeed.
A quick update on some of the results that have come in while the guests there were talking to Kirsty. Plaid Cymru leader Adam Price has been re-elected in Carmarthen East and Dinefwr. Labour have held on to Cynon Valley, which is a big Labour stronghold in the Aberdare region of South Wales. A very bad result for the Lib Dems because their only constituency member of the Senedd in Wales was Kirsty Williams, the former Education Minister. She stood down this time. The Lib Dems, I think she had a very big personal vote. The Lib Dems have lost that seat. The Conservatives have gained Brecon and Radger from the Lib Dems. So a big blow to the Lib Dems in Wales from that result, and a boost to the Conservatives too, who actually have the parliamentary seat for Westminster as well. So an interesting seat in itself. We were talking about the projected national share. Let me remind you again of what John Curtis had shared with us a short while ago before I bring my next guest in. So the projected national share, this is what would have happened if there'd been an election in England based on these votes today. So that's the big qualification. 36 to the Tories, 29 to Labour, 17 to the Lib Dems. As I say, it's based on a different voting pattern, and 18 to the others. So with that in mind, and that gap of 7 points between Labour and Conservative, I'm going to welcome Peter Kyle, who's the Labour MP for Hove, Shadow Justice Minister. I owe you a big vote of thanks, Peter, for being so patient and waiting to talk to us. So thank you very much for joining us. That projected national share and that gap of 7%, now, does that surprise you? Does that comfort you? I mean, where are you on that?
Well, I'm certainly not comforted. This is a very disappointing set of results. The fact that we've lost places like Hartlepool in the by-election there is a real body blow for the Labour Party, because we have a lot of shared history with the industrial history of places like Hartlepool, and the fact that a community like that has decided to part ways with us at this particular moment in time is a very difficult thing for us to stomach. We will learn a lot from it, but also we will use this defeat in this election to rebound and regroup and come back much with a changed Labour Party, and a Labour Party that is changing faster and changing deeper. Those are the words of Keir Starmer today. And whereas today is a very difficult day for us, actually there is great optimism, and I believe that we are going to use this moment in time to realign the priorities with the Labour Party to match those of the country, because they have told us quite loudly and quite clearly in these set of elections that they feel that our priorities are not aligned with theirs. But if we do, I believe there is a very great future for Labour Party, not in the distant future, but in the short term.
OK, I'm going to come back to faster and deeper change and realigning priorities and what that means. The reason I said comforted was this, because you might have thought it was odd. It's because John Curtis and I discussing earlier, we're noting this 7% gap on the projected national share. And given the way in which some Labour figures have responded today, including, by the way, Sir Keir Starmer earlier on when he gave that interview, as John was suggesting, you know, it looked, people are reacting as if it was a double figure gap, or, you know, why the intense reaction from some people as if it was a complete and utter meltdown, which, you know, you could argue looking at your councils and everything else, it is not. It's disappointing, clearly, and you've had several bad blows, but you know, 7% is something that is not insurmountable. So given that, Peter, I'm just wondering, give viewers a bit of an example. Let's have a practical example. When you talk about realigning priorities with voters, what is a practical example of that? Because I'm talking about a policy offering, really. How do you realign your priorities in that sense?
Well, first of all, I take your point. I mean, the Labour Party in the south of England, for example, has made some real gains. We've made gains in Surrey. We've even taken a seat off the Tories in the Isle of Wight. More gains in Kent. So there are some optimistic signs here. But overall, the reason why the Labour Party is struggling today is that some of our real heartlands, the communities that have been wedded to the Labour Party and the Labour Party have served for so long, have turned against us. And that's why it's a difficult day for the Labour Party. In terms of moving forward and practical examples of the change, it is simply that the public have told us, and I've heard it because I was up in Hartlepool several times, and most of this week I've been in across the country in various different places. People have said that the Labour Party is talking too much to itself and serving some of the interests that are priorities for the Labour Party and not talking enough about the interests of working people up and down the country. So I think you're going to see in the coming weeks and in the coming months and perhaps much sooner, a sharp realignment where the Labour Party is more aligned with the economic realities of everyday working people up and down the country. I think that is one of the clear examples that you're going to see in the coming days and weeks. We've been told that in certain areas, we talk too much about some of the sort of contemporary cultural issues, not enough about some of the hard realities faced and the economic realities faced by people who aren't down at the very, very bottom, in the words of some of the voters who've spoken to me, who aren't there at the very, very top, and we sometimes talk too much about them and how we want to take some of the money off of them in terms of taxation. But everyday working people who are working incredibly hard and actually want to be recognised more by the Labour Party. That's what I'm talking about, and I think that is what Keir is talking about. And those are the kinds of things you're going to see a lot more of in the coming days and weeks.
Well, you know, people like Glenn McCluskey and others today, some former colleagues of yours in the Commons, have been saying to us, hang on a second, this is exactly what Jeremy Corbyn is about. He was about aligning the party with the interests of working people. You know, what are these people talking about? So what's your answer to them?
Well, I don't recognise the correlation between the two. The voters told us absolutely categorically in numerous elections, don't forget we lost 60 MPs in the 2019 election, that we weren't aligned to them. So I'm sorry, there is an electoral reality that is at stake in the business of politics, and it's unavoidable. So we have to accept that the public say that we have drifted from their priorities, we're not speaking to their priorities, and actually Keir has said very, very clearly today that he's going to launch a review into policies. I'm pleased about that. It'll be a quick review, and that he is going to go deeper and faster in realigning the Labour Party. And what I think needs to happen really clearly is we have got to stop, in the eyes of the public, talking to ourselves too often, and then break out into a conversation with the public which roots ourselves in the values of Britain, celebrates the values of Britain, is comfortable with our history and culture and achievements as a country, and figures out where we are going as a country and puts our values and principles to work to serve that future, deliver a better future than we're enjoying at the moment. You know, we need to rebuild our economy. We need to rebuild after the bad Brexit deal. We need to rebuild after the pandemic. So we have a very exciting future ahead as a country. But Labour's long-term values and principles are built to tackle these big moments in time. That's what Keir is now focused on. We've just heard from the public. They want us to realign in this way. And that's what I'm really excited about being able to be a part of going forward, because that's where Keir is taking us.
Well, it's tantalising, all of these hints, Peter, and we look forward to seeing exactly how they manifest themselves. Just a last point, if you would. Do you think that the current leadership lineup, as in the front bench, I'm not talking about the party leader, is actually the one that Keir Starmer thinks will be able to deliver this alignment and will be able to connect properly and efficiently with voters? Or can we expect that front bench lineup to change also in a radical way?
Well, I love the way you've just opened a huge sort of bear trap for me to jump into. I'm on the front bench, so it'd be totally self-serving of me to start talking about these things, and it's way above my pay grade. But what I will say is what I believe how Keir will be moving forward. Keir is in the business of identifying what the priorities for our country is. He will be realigning our policy offering to much better align with those priorities, to bring them together. And of course, the personnel that is going to be tasked for delivering it will flow from the purpose that we are set, the policy purpose. So the policy purpose is going to come first, I expect, and I know that everything that flows from it is going to be in the best interests of voters, rooted in the priorities of our country. That comes first and foremost. That is the task that Keir has set himself and the Labour Party. And everything else, including the lineup and personnel and personalities, are going to flow from that.
Peter Kyle, very good of you to join us. Thank you so much. Peter Kyle there, the Labour MP for Hove, and the Shadow Justice Minister, giving a spirited defence of the plans for radical realignment that he says Keir Starmer is going to deliver within weeks, with some changes, he said, possibly even sooner than that. So we'll keep an eye. Now, in all of these counts, we've been talking about Scotland, Wales and England, probably, I speak from, some experience here, one of the slowest processes is actually in London, where the process of, electing to the Assembly in London, and then, of course, the actual result of the mayoral election, all of this tends to take quite a while, and it can go over a couple of days and all the rest of it. So Reeta has got some London constituency results up for us, and I'm just wondering, Reeta, just give us a progress report, and where are we heading at the moment?
Well, it's very interesting, the London results, because London, of course, is thought to be a very sort of safe Labour stronghold, but we are seeing some churn in these results. So just to talk you through this, it says London constituency results, but these are the initial votes for the London mayor. The way it works is that people vote within their constituencies and the votes are then aggregated all together. There are 14 constituencies and the votes are all added up, and the mayoral contest takes place on the basis of the aggregated score. Now, what we have here is the initial 6 constituency results, and as you can see, there has been some churn in Ealing and Hillingdon, for example, where last time in 2016 Labour topped the poll. Well, this time round, and this is why it's gone blue, it's the Conservative candidate Shaun Baillie who has topped the poll. And if I just show you the that is the share in terms of the vote, and this is the share change. So the Conservatives have gone up 1 and Labour is down 4, and that represents a swing from Labour to Conservative of 2.7%. Now, these initial figures are suggesting to us that Labour is down around 4 percentage points. Conservatives overall are roughly the same, and the Greens have picked up a couple of percentage points, as has one of the independents, Lawrence Fox. Let's take a look at the other one, where, again, Labour topped the poll last time round, Brent and Harrow, and this time it's the Conservatives, Shaun Baillie, on 65,500 votes. And if we just take a look again at that is the share that the parties have got. And Conservatives up a little bit, but it's Labour who've dropped by 6% there. And I think the swing is roughly similar to what we saw before. Actually, it's a little bit more, 3.5% from Labour to Conservative. So those are quite eye-catching results. There's also, for example, West Central, which is slightly better news for Labour. So, again, Conservatives have topped the poll this time round, just as they did last time round 5 years ago. But actually, if we look at the change in the share of the vote, the Conservatives are down 8% and Labour is up slightly. So in West Central, although the Conservatives are topping the poll, actually there is that swing to Labour. What does this all mean? Well, you have to bear in mind that it is it's a second preference process. So if one of the candidates gets 50% of the vote or over, they immediately win the mayoral contest and they become mayor. But if they don't, then it's a runoff between the top 2 candidates and everybody else in the list. Their second preference votes are redistributed to the top 2. So this is some way in the process, if you like. As Huw said, London takes quite a while, but these are the first indications of some movement, certainly, in the London vote.
Reeta, thanks very much. And we can return to Adina Campbell, who is at Alexandra Palace, where the London votes are being counted. Adina Campbell, that is Shaun Baillie, the Tory candidate, beaten Sadiq Khan on the first round in Brent and Ealing. That must have come as a bit of a shock to Sadiq Khan. He wasn't expecting that one.
Yeah, I mean, it is a very mixed picture by the results which have come in tonight here at Alexandra Palace. Going by the very first borough that declared its counts, that's Brent and Harrow. It showed that Shaun Baillie secured a majority of the votes here with just over 65,000 first preference votes, followed closely by Labour's Sadiq Khan with almost 62,000 first choice votes. The next count to be declared here was the count in North East London, the North East London borough. A massive turn there. 111,000 votes for Sadiq Khan, but much lower for Shaun Baillie, with just over 40,000 first preference votes. So it is looking very much like a two-horse race between the Labour and Conservatives. The other 18 candidates not even within touching distance of the two front runners. But we have to be cautious of this at this stage because there are more constituencies to get through over the next 24 hours. So we will be watching closely here. But at the moment, I'd say a very, very mixed picture.
And how does it compare to what the Tories did in 2008 and 2012 at this stage?
Well, at this stage, back in 2016, Labour's Sadiq Khan actually won the election on second preference votes. So, I mean, it's not usual for the person who wins the London Mayor election to win on those first preference votes. It normally does go through to the second round. So we are expecting the final declaration at the very earliest at some point tomorrow evening, maybe into the early hours of Sunday morning because of the COVID safety measures in place, and that obviously slowing down the counting process. But we will be keeping a close eye here. But at the moment, it looks like it is definitely a battle between the Conservative Party and Labour.
Adina, thanks very much indeed. Now, at this stage, we can take stock. You've heard that phrase in politics before. We can take stock of what's been happening in Scotland and where we are up to now. So we have 47 of the 129 seats declared. Remember, of those, 73 seats are constituencies, but we're still to get a whole slew of 56 list seats that will return 56 MSPs to the Scottish Parliament. So there is a long way to go. But in terms of the important seats that SNP had to crack if they were going to return to the Parliament with an outright majority, let's see what's happened there. The SNP have got 38 seats, that's up by 3. Liberal Democrats on 4. The Conservatives 3, that's -2. Labour 2, -1. We can now turn to our correspondent, Alan Little. Alan, where are we tonight? John Curtis was quite clear. It's pretty unlikely that the SNP will return with an outright majority.
The road to a majority now seems to be blocked, and it's striking how successful the pro-union parties have been in collaborating with each other, or their electorates have been collaborating with each other. So, for example, in Edinburgh Southern, many natural Conservative voters voting for the Labour candidate as the most likely to keep the SNP out. In Eastwood, many, and again in Dumbarton, many Conservative voters voting for Jackie Baillie to keep the SNP candidates out, and in Eastwood the opposite way, Labour voters supporting the Conservative candidate. But it's been an outstanding day, of course, for the SNP, but it does look as though the new Scottish Parliament will look a lot like the old Scottish Parliament, with possibly more Green representation. So the big question is, what will this do to the union over the next 5 years? And we know that historically, the union has been strong when there's been a shared sense of values and a shared sense of purpose, uniting the people of Scotland and the people of the rest of the United Kingdom. The age of empire, the age of industry, the 2 world wars, the post-war reconstruction, these were all pan-British enterprises that bound the people of Scotland into a shared product, a shared project, if you like. The question is now, we know equally that the union's at its weakest when Scotland has imposed on it policies and values that run counter to the prevailing values of the day. That was true in the 80s and 90s. That period transformed Scotland's attitude to its place in the union, produced this building, Scottish Parliament, and the same thing is, I can hear echoes of it today in the Brexit project. Scotland does not want to walk the Brexit path, but it will have to as part of the United Kingdom. How much damage that will do to Scots' faith in the union, we'll have to wait and see.
And of course it also means that we have a substantial number of MSPs who owe their position in the Parliament to votes from a party not their own. So when it comes to talking about policy and keeping the constituents happy, it's going to be very interesting to see how politics pans out.
Yeah, what emerged after the 2014 referendum was the collapse of the old left-right spectrum in politics and the emergence of two new tribes called Yes and No. And the pro-union parties have had to aggregate around a single candidate and make sure that by dividing, the SNP doesn't get in by the simple process of dividing the pro-union vote. And that has become a characteristic of Scottish politics now. And it is here to say, and it's quite impressive how well organised that is, how instinctively voters who support the union know which candidate to vote for.
Alan, thanks very much indeed.
Kirsty and Alan, thank you. We have 1 hour to go on this coverage, and this is our final hour of the day before we return tomorrow. Don't panic, everyone. We will be back. We will be back with our wine gums and our, well, I shouldn't actually give any brand names, but it's red and, you know, it's a farm animal, yes? So there you go. You have to guess what it is. And actually, the wine gums and that are a very good combination. It's like sort of high-octane fuel. So that's what we're doing. I'm not asking Kirsty for her energy secrets because she's looking much fresher than I am, OK? And much more elegant as well, can I say. And you're getting lots of comments, actually, Kirsty, about your magnificent coat on social media. Leave alone your magnificent analysis, OK? So you've had a good day. I can tell you that for nothing. We're coming back after the news. That's just in a second. And if Mr Mark Drakeford, the First Minister of Wales, is watching our coverage, and why wouldn't he be? Mark, can we just say that you're very welcome to come on to have a chat with us about your party's performance in Wales. I can't imagine that you're going to be shy about it. So if Mr Drakeford is around and wants to talk to us, we'd be very happy to have him on the programme. You've got until, let's say, 9:45, OK, to turn up. So we'd be very pleased if you did that. So Kirsty and I will take just a little break and we'll join Shaun for the news.
Huw, thank you very much and good evening. Election results have been coming in throughout the day across England, Scotland and Wales. The Conservatives are celebrating a major victory in the Hartlepool by-election, winning the seat for the first time in more than 60 years. Meanwhile, in Scotland, results in the Parliament elections are still coming in, with the SNP hoping to secure an outright majority and further its calls for another independence referendum. Results thus far suggest it could be incredibly close. Damon Grammaticus has more.
A Tory triumph, not the balloon, that wasn't the best likeness, but for Boris Johnson this was another Labour stronghold demolished. Jill Mortimer is the first Conservative MP to represent Hartlepool in 57 years.
If there's a lesson out of this whole election campaign, the whole local election campaign across the whole of the UK, it's that the public want politicians to get on with focusing on their needs and their priorities.
And the region delivered another bitter blow for Labour. Its candidate for Tees Valley Mayor was soundly beaten too. The Conservative incumbent, Ben Houchen, returned with more than 70% of the vote. In council elections, Conservatives took control of Nuneaton and Bedworth in the West Midlands and Basildon in Essex. Glum Labour faces as Harlow in Essex went to the Tories and Dudley in the West Midlands too. Labour did retain control of Liverpool and councils in Manchester, Hastings and Exeter, but that was little comfort to its leader.
Well, I'm bitterly disappointed in the results and, you know, I take full responsibility for the results and I will take full responsibility for fixing things.
The Greens have been picking up seats here from Labour in Sheffield.
Well done, fantastic!
The Liberal Democrats from the Conservatives in Cambridgeshire. In the Welsh Parliament election, Labour lost the Vale of Clwyd to the Conservatives.
Thank you.
But won Rhondda from Plaid Cymru and have seen off other challenges, so in Wales at least Labour are celebrating. Scotland's Parliament is where the result could be the most consequential.
Well done.
The SNP has taken Ayr and Edinburgh Central. The question here, can Nicola Sturgeon get an overall majority? If so, how soon might she push for independence?
Extremely happy and extremely confident that we are on track in the SNP for a fourth consecutive election victory and to have the ability to form a government again. And that's an extraordinary achievement for any political party.
North and south of the border, the final shape of things will only be clear over the weekend. But what happens in Scotland could take some of the wind out of Boris Johnson's celebrations. Democraticus, BBC News.
In other news tonight, Portugal, Gibraltar and Israel are among 12 countries which people in England will be able to travel to from the 17th of May without having to quarantine when they return home. Popular destinations like Spain, France and Italy are not yet on what's known as the government's green list, which means there are minimum requirements for travellers. The Transport Secretary Grant Shapps says the list will be expanded only when it's safe to do so.
The signs overseas are now more promising as a result of their vaccination programmes beginning to crank up. And as the summer progresses, we hope that more traditional tourist destinations will be unlocked. But we have to turn the key slowly. And green list countries will be placed on a watch list if we start to have any concerns. And if it's necessary because of a new upswing in cases or a new variant, we'll not hesitate to act fast and withdraw green status.
The Transport Secretary Grant Shapps. Well, joining me now, Katie Bowman. Katie's editor of the Family Traveller magazine and online website. Katie Bowman, thanks very much for joining us tonight. Any surprises in this list for you?
Well, as travel editors and people in the travel industry felt about this, it was like watching the Grand National with the favourites coming in and the outsiders. And one sort of surprise that was absolutely definitely going to be on the green list was Malta. We've seen that that's been bumped to the amber list. But beyond that, the only surprise was how few countries were on it rather than how many. And basically, it's a sort of if in doubt situation. If in doubt, your country is probably on the amber list.
That obviously will mean that if people to travel to those countries, they can expect things like quarantine. Red list, they're not even going to be allowed back from if they dare to go. But presumably amber at least means you can go, but there will be consequences.
Well, Grant Shapps was very, very keen to point out that amber list is not the amber list as it was last summer. This is not a sort of play hard and fast with the rules and are you prepared to sort of stick around at home for 10 days and take that penalty on the chin. It is not for leisure travel at all beyond green. So that's amber list, red list is not for leisure travel at all. There are sort of clearer rules about how many tests you might take, how you quarantine. For example, you quarantine at home or in a place of your own choosing if you've returned from an amber list destination, whereas you would quarantine in a hotel at the expense of £1,750 if you'd returned from a red destination. But he was very clear that it's really holidays equal green list and nothing more.
Which raises the question, I suppose, given how many people were waiting for this list to appear, what's the effect been on holiday prices to those destinations in the last few hours?
So this is an interesting one. I'm watching this scenario as a travel editor, but also as an avid traveller with my 2 weeks in Portugal booked for July. I have held off booking flights, just seeing what's happening, seeing whether it's going to go ahead. And I have obviously been watching the flights, for example, to Faro Airport in the Algarve, Lisbon for the Silver Coast and Porto, and yet those flight prices have not changed from a month ago to a week ago to 5 minutes ago I checked, knowing that I was going to be speaking to you. And it's very interesting that there is this pent-up demand. We're all champing at the bit to get on holiday, and you would imagine that you'd see a spike in prices. But as far as Portugal's concerned, that I've not seen evidence of that yet.
That's very intriguing, because a lot of the websites that people book through rely on algorithms, don't they? So the more clicks there are and the more people show interest in particular flights, the more the price starts to go up. So, I mean, presumably that was just people aren't actually even looking at these options at the moment.
Well, I think we're all a lot more cautious than we were last summer. That's absolutely the case. And you must remember that this is for travel. Green list applies to May 17th. 3 weeks after that, there will be another review. 3 weeks after that, another review. Perhaps families, perhaps holiday makers are watching and waiting for their Greece trip or their Spanish trip or their Italian trip. It's very, very early days, and there's a long way to go until the sort of boom time of July and August. So it may be that people are hanging on, and we're certainly all, as a nation of travellers, much more cautious about jumping on planes than we were last summer.
Katie Bowman, editor of Family Traveller magazine and website, thank you so much. I doubtless we'll be talking to you again as those various iterations of the lists appear. For now, thank you. Now, the latest figures on infections show 2,490 people were reported to have become infected in the 24-hour period to Friday. That means on average about 2,060 cases, fresh cases every day in the last week. 15 deaths were reported in the 24 hours to Friday. That's people who had previously tested positive for COVID-19 in the 28 days before their death. 12 deaths on average announced every day in the past week. 127,598 people have been reported to have died during the period of the pandemic across the UK. As for vaccinations, the figure stands now at more than 35 million people having had their first COVID jab and more than 16.5 million people having had both jabs. Staying with the question of vaccination, the Joint Committee on Vaccination and Immunisation has recommended that people under the age of 40 should be offered an alternative to the AstraZeneca jab after concerns about blood clots in younger age groups. The age threshold is being raised as a precautionary measure. Meanwhile, England's Deputy Chief Medical Officer, Jonathan Van Tam, says the UK is still on course to give every adult in this country at least one coronavirus vaccine dose by the end of July. Well, Jeremy Brown is Professor of Respiratory Infection at University College London and sits on the Joint Committee on Vaccination and Immunisation. He is speaking to us in a personal capacity in terms of his opinion. But can I ask you, Professor Brown, was this kind of quite closely debated by members of the committee?
Yes, it's been debated over the past 2 or 3 weeks, really, and it's taken quite a long time to come to this decision because there are various factors that have to be taken into consideration. But the continuing fall in incidence is about half what it was a month ago of COVID infections, means now the chance of catching COVID is really quite low. And therefore, the very rare side effect that occurs with the AstraZeneca vaccine becomes more of an issue than it would be if there was a high incidence of infection. Essentially, if you are under the age of 40, the rare side effect is becomes an issue because your chance of getting severe COVID is so small now.
So in terms of the availability then of vaccine doses, is this going to cause any problems for the government in terms of the procurement of doses? Or would you say they have sufficient in their armoury to be able to adapt in this way?
Well, we are fortunate that there are 3 vaccines that are already used in this country, and there may be a couple more coming through over the next few months. So there is a bit of choice involved. I mean, it's always a problem if you restrict the use of a vaccine in a certain age group. And to be fair, we're not restricting the use. We're saying there's a preference for using the Pfizer or the Moderna. And we would still be using the AstraZeneca in people who are at high risk of infection and very specific circumstances where it's difficult to give people the Pfizer vaccine because of the fact that it has to be kept at minus 70 degrees in a freezer and those sort of issues. So there is enough supply of the other vaccines to ensure that we're still on course. That's the good news.
And on the practicalities of this, I mean, obviously, kind of older age groups will have already been jabbed with this. There's less, if hardly any particular concern for the older age groups, judging by this decision. But what about the practicalities? Is it possible? Do we yet know whether it's possible to mix and match with vaccines? In other words, if you had first jab with one vaccine, do you have to have the second from the same vaccine in order to be sure about the efficacy of it?
So at the moment, we're saying you take the second dose will be the same dose, same vaccine as the first dose. And there is no evidence that anybody with the second dose of the AstraZeneca has ever had this clot and thrombocytopenia, low platelet count problem. It doesn't seem to happen with the second dose. It either happens with the first dose or not. So it's perfectly safe for people who've had the AstraZeneca first dose to carry forward and have the second dose.
That's how you would offer reassurance. Sorry, you want to go on?
And so I think in the future we're going to have it's going to be more complicated because it's going to be difficult to match people to the original vaccine that they had when we come to boosters, which may or may not happen this year, but will probably happen at some point in the future. And so it'd be hard to be sure that you're going to get the same vaccine as you had the first time round. However, most of these vaccines, in fact, all the vaccines that we use in this country, use the same protein as the target for the vaccination, and it's very likely that the vaccines will be very easily used between each other and will stimulate very similar immune responses when you have a mixed vaccine rather than the same vaccine. So we haven't got the data. It's coming. There's a specific trial looking into this. We will get data on that later in the year, probably by the summer.
Professor Jeremy Brown from University College London, thank you very much.
Pleasure.
Fresh allegations of sexual misconduct have been made against the actor and director Noel Clarke, relating to his time on the BBC's Doctor Who. More women have come forward and spoken to the Guardian newspaper, alleging incidents of harassment and inappropriate behaviour during the making of the BBC One series. The BBC says it's shocked to hear of the allegations. Noel Clarke has denied all the claims made against him. Police in Kent are appealing to the public to help identify a man who was seen close to where the police community support officer Julia James was killed the day after. They've released a photograph that was taken in Kent the day after the 53-year-old died. She was found dead in Ackholt Wood near her home 10 days ago. Post-mortem revealed she died from significant head injuries. Helena Wilkinson has more.
Who is this man? Detectives desperately need to know. They say he could be the key to unlocking what happened to Julia James.
Somebody knows who that man is. We desperately need you to make contact with us and help us identify who that person is. If that person is watching, please make contact with us. We believe that you have crucial information.
The man in the image that police have released today was spotted somewhere along this country lane in Aylsham last Wednesday, the day after the body of Julia James was discovered. This is an area that's not far from the crime scene. Where the photograph came from or who took it, police won't say. Julia James had been walking her dog when she was attacked. Just a few hundred yards from her home, she suffered significant head injuries. Her husband posted this photograph of them both, saying how much he missed her. A reward of up to £10,000 has been offered by Crime Stoppers for information leading to a conviction in this case. Officers from forces across the country have now been asked to support Kent Police on what continues to be a challenging case for them. On the 10th day of this investigation, they're hoping they're getting closer to the breakthrough they need. Helena Wilkinson, BBC News, Aylsham in Kent.
Those are the main news stories. Now back to elections 2021.
Welcome back to Election 21 from Huw and from me.
Yes, indeed, Kirsty, and welcome to everyone. We're coming to the end of this marathon broadcast today. Not too many results to come in now, I don't think, between now and 10 o'clock. So the best thing, I think, is for us to try to start to summarise what's been going on over the last 13 hours or so. And we'll start with the position in Scotland and the state of the party. So let's turn to Reeta to have a look at that.
This is where we are, Huw, with 48 of the 129 seats declared. These are all constituency seats, so the first past the post seats, not the regional list seats, which will come a little bit later. Those are the proportional representation ones. And as you can see, not all that much churn, actually, in terms of actual seats gained and lost. The SNP have gained 3, Conservatives have lost 2, and Labour has lost 1. Let's just take a look at those 3 seats. So the SNP gained Ayr by a tiny margin, but it was a gain for them. A different story in Edinburgh Central, where they had a very big gain there. Angus Robertson becoming the MSP for Edinburgh Central. Now, this was Ruth Davidson, the former Conservative leader in Scotland, her seat before, but he got a majority of nearly 5,000 there. And if you just take a look at the share of the vote, so 39% for the SNP as compared to 28% for the Conservatives. The share change is pretty dramatic, isn't it? 10% rise for the SNP, and we should be able to see here the swing from Conservative to SNP of 6.6%. And the other SNP gain, if that was from the Conservatives, this is from Labour. Labour held on to their very marginal seat in Dumbarton, but they lost this one, also a marginal, and this was gained by the SNP's Paul McLennan. So a smaller majority than we saw in Edinburgh Central. But let me just show you. So that is the share of the vote. The two top parties pretty close, but the SNP putting on 4%, which enabled them to then swoop in and gain this seat from Labour. So that is the swing.
Reeta, thank you very much indeed. And I'm joined now by Nick Eardley again. Now, Nick, the SNP are certainly still in the running for an outright majority. What would be the route to that?
Well, it's very hard, and it's probably going to come down to one seat. So in SNP HQ, they're wargaming this tonight, and there are two potential routes. One which is very unlikely, one which is feasible. The feasible one is that they win West Aberdeenshire, and they keep one list seat in the south of Scotland and one list seat in the Highlands and Islands. Now that would be down to in the south of Scotland, but remember they've won extra constituencies, so it balances it out.
So remind me of the majority in West Aberdeenshire.
The majority in West Aberdeenshire is a fairly small one. Let me just find my notes here, I've not got it to hand. It is 900. So it's small, but it's in the northeast where things haven't always been. It's been a mixed bag in the northeast. Sometimes it's been a bad result for the SNP, sometimes it's been okay. So they'll be watching that seat like a hawk tomorrow. That could be one of the last seats we get though. So it'll probably be fairly late into the afternoon tomorrow. So that's 3 seats that way. The other way, which is a lot less likely, is they keep one in the Highlands and Islands list, and somehow the maths works out that they get one in the south of Scotland and one somewhere else. That feels unlikely, and it does feel like that that seat tomorrow in Aberdeenshire West is going to be really crucial, but it's a long shot at the moment.
Thank you, Nick, for now, but I'm going to turn now to Drew Hendry, the MP for Inverness. Drew Hendry, do you make a similar calculation to Nick there, that really Aberdeenshire West is your best bet?
Well, I think it's always been clear that getting a majority in this electoral system is an incredible challenge. We've done a fantastic job today, I think, winning a 4th election on the trot now. You know, some great breakthroughs with it, but you know, if we get a majority, it will be down to those factors that are on the list. But we'll have to wait and see.
So what impact do you think the return of Angus Robertson will have to the Scottish Parliament?
Well, I think it's a fantastic gain for the SNP. You heard the majority that he managed to secure there. That doesn't surprise me, knowing the man and the performance that he puts in for his constituency and his parliamentary skills. I think he'd be a great asset to the Scottish Parliament. I'm delighted to have both him as a former MP colleague and, of course, Neil Gray, who also had a spectacular victory in Airdrie and Shotts today from Westminster, now in the Scottish Parliament.
And, of course, I think I'm right in saying that, of course, Neil Gray's transfer, as it were, will mean there'll be a by-election.
Well, there is a by-election, I think, in the next week in Airdrie and Shotts.
And that in itself gives you a chance for another indication.
Yeah, unlike Douglas Ross, Neil Gray did the right thing and actually stood down from his Westminster seat to fight this election. He wasn't going to try and take up 2 jobs in addition to, as Douglas Ross does, running the line.
Yes, I mean, it's fair to say, of course, that Alex Salmond did the 2 jobs line as well for some time, and I don't think the SNP were complaining too much about that when he did it.
Well, of course, the SNP have now made it clear that we, don't have a dual mandate position, and Neil Gray did the right thing, stepping down from his Westminster seat and taking up and winning very handsomely to go and be an MSP, where I think he'll be another fantastic addition to the SNP team there, along with, as you said, Angus Robertson. This is a very talented team with some great fresh intake we have from the MSPs across the SNP today. Of course, not just Edinburgh Central, but in Ayr and East Lothian gaining seats as well.
What Alex Salmond said to us in the programme tonight, he sort of conceded that the list is not necessarily going well enough to return many ALBA MSPs from the list. That magic figure of perhaps 5% or 6% is not likely to be reached. However, there are two former SNP MPs who are now ALBA MPs at Westminster. What do you think their role is going to be, and how are you going to operate with ALBA MPs who, after all, have essentially defected from the SNP to Alex Salmond's fledgling party?
Well, we'll operate as we always have done, as a group that's focused on getting the right things done for Scotland to make sure that we're providing Scotland's voice. I can't speak for those others who've decided to take that path. That's up to them. But we'll always work with people who want to do the right things to make sure that we're putting the benefits and people of Scotland, the benefits for the people of Scotland first. So we'll see what happens with that. But I can't talk about folk that are not in our party. That's something you'd have to ask them about.
Drew Hendry, thank you very much indeed.
Thank you.
27 minutes past 9, and as we get towards the end of this broadcast, why don't we just have a look and just, looking at the figures and maybe sort of experimenting with the figures in a certain way. And what we've done is fed the pattern so far into the machine, and we've come up with a BBC projection for the House of Commons. OK, we're not taking it that seriously. It's just for us to have a look and, just see what we think about it. And there it is for you. 326 obviously needed for a majority in the House of Commons. And this projection, based on the votes we've seen today, would put the Conservatives on 327. Well, that's not a majority of 80, is it? Such as Boris Johnson's got at the moment. Labour on 226, the Lib Dems on 24, which would be quite an increase, and the others on 73. And that would include all the smaller parties, of course, and they'd include the SNP as well. So that's the kind of picture that you'd get. I know lots of you will be just jumping up and down and saying, well, it's kind of nonsense to try to project in that way. But anyway, it just gives you a sense of how these figures today would feed through. So let's talk a little bit about that, but with the real votes we had today as well, with Emily Gray, who's from Ipsos Mori, the pollsters in Scotland. Hi, Emily, it's nice to have you with us. And James Johnson, former Conservative Party pollster who worked very closely with Theresa May. And it's good to have you with us, James. Thank you very much as well. Emily, can I start with you? And given your expertise there, certainly to start with in Scotland, what do you make of these results, and are they in line with what you had been forecasting, and where have been, if any, the surprises for you?
Well, of course, one of the big questions was whether the SNP was able to win a majority or not, and that was always going to come down to a handful of key marginal seats, and certainly we've seen that play out today. So while the SNP was able to make three gains, losing Eastwood and Dumbarton, of course, makes it more difficult for the party to get a majority. And I think the big thing that we've seen there is just more tactical voting from unionists on the constitutional vote to keep the SNP out by voting for whichever of the unionist parties, be that the Conservatives, the Labour or the Lib Dems, is most likely to beat the SNP locally. And we know that the top issue for voters at this election, the top issue that people have say would be very important to how they would cast their vote, was that question of independence. So while other issues such as education, the NHS, managing the economy all matter too, the big thing for people was independence, and we are seeing more alignment now than we did a couple of years back between which party people were planning to vote for and their position on independence.
It's interesting, Emily, isn't it? Because lots of people sometimes say, oh, well, tactical voting, some people do it doesn't lead to much. This is a concerted exercise in tactical voting in some of these constituencies, and shifting really thousands of votes at the same time. So, it's in some of these seats, as you just mentioned, it certainly had an effect.
Absolutely, and it would be fascinating to see how that shakes out on the regional list as well tomorrow. So something that we were picking up at the start of the campaign was with the launch of Alex Salmond's ALBA party, we saw that almost drew attention to to being able to use that regional vote tactically either to help build a greater majority for independence or for staying in the union. But certainly in the polling, what we have seen is that doesn't seem to have been benefiting Alba as much as it has other pro-independence parties like the Scottish Greens, and that we will find out tomorrow. So the share of the regional vote that the Greens end up with as the other big pro-independence party in the Scottish Parliament.
Indeed, that's to come, Emily. That's to come. Thank you very much for just turning to James. For your sense, James, really of the Conservative performance, can we just talk principally about England? Although, of course, there are some interesting examples in Scotland and Wales, I know that. But, you know, what will the Conservatives be looking at in terms of the areas that were even stronger than they'd expected today?
Well, certainly, as you say, Hartlepool, the Tees Valley, where Ben Houchen, the Conservative incumbent there, won a huge aspect of the vote. The Conservatives will be very, very happy with those. They will also be having an eye to other red wall areas in the North and the Midlands where they've done better on 2016, but actually broadly matched where they were in 2017 and 2019. And they'll be looking to the south as well, Cambridgeshire, where actually those trends that you saw in 2019, where the south, more liberal, more educated, younger voters, slightly turning away from the Conservatives. I think the Conservatives will be looking back at this election and thinking, this is 2019 Mark II. We're not seeing huge advances. It's very easy to get carried away by results like that Hartlepool result this morning. But actually, that's really a seat that's playing catch up with what happened in 2019. So I think they'll be looking back, seeing this repeats from that last election and realising that, yes, clearly for midterm, they are in a very strong position, but they're not unconquerable either.
That's interesting, isn't it? Because the conclusion there will be certainly noted by lots of people watching. And I'm just thinking, OK, if you're saying not unconquerable, so what would be the weak areas, given that we've been talking about strength and you know, strong performances, what would be the weak areas then going forward for the Conservatives based on this set of results?
So if we look in the polling of the Red Wall, obviously it's difficult to compare to 2019 because it was a snap election. There weren't local elections on that day. But if we look at some of the polling in the Red Wall, you see that since 2019, the Labour Party has gained some Lib Dem voters. Now, we're not really seeing that in these elections because obviously the Lib Dem vote in local elections tends to be a bit higher. But nationally, if that were to happen, then that immediately gives Labour a boost, even in those more working class seats. Now, the key thing is, can the Conservatives hold their vote? Now, we're looking at today, what today has certainly shown us is that Brexit and Jeremy Corbyn were not the only conditions the Conservatives needed to win these votes. They're holding on to them despite those two things being off the plate. Now, we've done some polling on election day. We did some polling yesterday that's come in today. And that shows the main reason people are voting for the Tories are a sense that they're the most competent party and the sense that they've handled the pandemic, namely the vaccine rollout, particularly well. If that were to change, and if you ran these elections in November last year, when people were really doubting the Conservatives' competence on the pandemic, that could look very different. So that's one of the key things for Labour to try and chip away at. Obviously, that's not how elections work. They happened yesterday, and that clearly was a pretty bad position for Labour.
Emily, if I can just pick up from you as Kirsty here in Edinburgh, just what you were saying there about the tactical voting and the effectiveness of it. And obviously it shifted the dial. And what we were saying earlier was because, of course, the learning process for that came much earlier. It came in the first election referendum when people were prepared to park their political differences to have their cultural allegiance to whether they supported independence or not. So actually they've got form here, they've got training in it. And you think moving forward we're going to see more of that playing out in Scotland if, as we think we are going to be, leading up to the possibility of another referendum?
Yeah, I mean, it's difficult to say because, of course, the SNP will, come what may, be the dominant party still in the Scottish Parliament, and has been 14 years in government now. And actually, when we ask voters about party competence in Scotland and which parties they trust most, then the SNP does still come out as the most trusted party on a whole range of key issues. From from the economy to education to the NHS. But I think it's an interesting question about. Certainly, we've seen more alignment, as I say, between the party that people are planning to vote for and their position on independence. And so we'll need to see how that shakes out over the coming months.
Well, James, if you were advising Douglas Ross on what to say to Boris Johnson at the end of this, what would be your advice? What way should Douglas Ross play his relationship with Boris Johnson?
Well, it really depends on what side the SNP majority comes down on. I mean, if they do get a majority, then I think Boris Johnson has to step really carefully. A lot of focus groups and research that I've done with voters who are voting for SNP, but they're not that keen on independence referendum, they really do get over to the Nicola Sturgeon side if Boris Johnson does a flat no, if the Conservatives say no way, it's never happening. So it might be that Boris Johnson might need to temper his language a little bit. It might be that Douglas Ross might need to say, don't give a flat no, don't say never, ever, ever, but say not now, now is not the time instead. However, if there's not an SNP majority, even if there's an independence majority, I expect politically that does give Boris Johnson a little bit more room for manoeuvre to say no.
James, good to have you with us. Emily as well. Thank you both for your insightful comments. It's good to have your company tonight. We'll be talking to Lord Finkelstein of the Times and Steve Richards, the author and broadcaster. They're coming up in a second to give us their thoughts on what the day has brought. Before that, Rita, can we just run through the state of the parties in England? And, now that we have, mainly half of the councils declared?
Absolutely. Yes, this is how things stand at the moment. These are the councillors that you're seeing for each of the main parties. And as you can see, the Conservatives have gained 161 councillors. Labour has lost 174. The Lib Dems have lost 27. The Greens have gained 40 councillors. And UKIP has lost 17. And if we take a look at what that means in terms of councils. As Huw said, 73 of 143 councils have declared. Well, Labour has lost control of 4. The Conservatives have gained 8.
Sorry, Rita, we're just going to go to Cardiff West, where the First Minister is standing, Mark Drakeford.
Officer for the Cardiff West constituency declare that the total number of votes given to each candidate was as follows.
Mae Paul Orders, swyddog canlyniadau etholaethol ar gyfer etholaeth Gorllewin Caerdydd yn datgan fod cyfanswm nifer y pleidleisiau a roedd wedi bob plaid ac ymgeisydd unigol.
So this is Cardiff West, and this is the seat where Mark Drakeford, the First Minister, is standing. And not a big majority last time. Let's see.
Plaid Cymru, the Party of Wales, 5,897 votes.
Rhys Aberwen, Plaid Cymru, 5,897.
Captain Beanie, 95 votes.
Captain Beanie, 95.
Lee David Patrick Canning abolished the Welsh Assembly Party, 682 votes.
Lee David Patrick Canning.
So that Plaid Cymru vote is significantly down on last time in 2016.
Mark Drakeford, Welsh Labour, 17,665 votes.
Mark Drakeford,
well, that's a massive majority for the First Minister.
Sean Driscoll, Welsh Conservative Party candidate, 6,454 votes.
Sean Driscoll, ymgeisydd Plaid Geidwaladol Cymru, 6,454.
David Peter Griffin, Green Party, 1,287 votes.
David Peter Griffin,
so we're looking at a majority of about 11,000 for Mark Drakeford. Last time it was 1,100.
John Marshall, Welsh Liberal Democrats, put recovery first, 803 votes.
Heath John Marshall, Democratiaid Rhyddfrydol Cymru, adfywio.
And we'll stay on this because we may well get a speech from Mr Drakeford.
Neil John McAvoy, Propel Wales Needs Champions, 3,473 votes.
Neil John McAvoy, Propel Mae Cymru angen pencampwyr, 3,473.
Nick Mullins, Reform UK, 175 votes.
Nick Mullins, Reform UK, 175.
Therefore, I give public notice that Mark Drakeford is duly elected as the member of the Senedd for the Cardiff West constituency.
So look at that majority of 11,211 for Mark Drakeford for Welsh Labour, the First Minister. Significant increase on his majority last time.
So the total number of votes cast across Cardiff West.
And let's just have a look at the share. We'll stay with it just in case we hear from the First Minister. And Mark Drakeford's vote up 13%. The Tories more or less where they were. Plaid down 16, a big drop on last time. And Propel, this new party that's been put into place on the nationalist side, up 10% from nothing. So, and the Greens more or less the same, the Lib Dems more or less the same. Let's just see what's going on.
And I'll now ask the successful candidate to say a few words.
So, Mark Drakeford, the First Minister of Wales. Let's see what he says about his performance and his party's.
Wel, diolch yn fawr iawn. Dwi'n mynd I fod yn byr achos mae'n hwyr.
I'm going to be very brief, and it's rather late.
Indeed. I'm going to be very brief given the time in the evening. Thank you to the presiding officer and particularly to all the staff who have worked so hard and stayed so late in the extraordinary circumstances of this election. Can I thank my opponents from the mainstream parties during this election for the democratically respectful way in which this campaign has been conducted. I really appreciate that very much. So, diolch yn fawr iawn I chi gyd. I must, of course, thank all my supporters who have worked throughout this campaign without having a candidate here to work with them for so many evenings and parts of the last month. You have been absolutely fantastic. My agent, Selwyn Hughes, once again, but everybody who's played their part. Diolch o galon I chi gyd. And of course, mostly and mainly to the residents and citizens of the Cardiff West constituency for once again placing their faith in me and in Welsh Labour to represent them at the Senedd over the next 5 years. Diolch yn fawr, thank you all very much indeed.
Well, those were brief remarks, and we didn't get really a commentary there from the First Minister on how his party's done, but I can't believe that he's not pleased with what Welsh Labour's done in so many areas of Wales, because they've outperformed lots of expectations. They fought off a Conservative challenge in many areas. They fought off a Plaid Cymru challenge and indeed gained a seat from Plaid Cymru in the Rhondda. So it'll be a very happy Mark Drakeford, but very much in the style of the First Minister, if I may say so, to be understated and to be thanking people around him and not to be making any great tub-thumping speech at this time of night about Welsh Labour's performance. But, you know, let's face it, when we heard from Sir Keir Starmer much earlier today, that was a contribution that said all about we've got to learn loads of lessons and it's been bad and we need to reconnect with our voters. That is not a message, on the basis of these results, that Mark Drakeford needs to be giving. And I think that there may well be questions about, you know, are there any lessons? As I spoke to Vaughan Gething earlier, the Health Minister in Wales, are there any lessons which Welsh Labour could share with the leadership in London, with Sir Keir's office about, you know, what has worked in some of those areas in Wales where they are heavy Brexit voting areas, as they were back in 2016, where the Conservatives have been able to make some inroads. So there are very, you know, pertinent lessons that may be learnt in that sense. They're very similar challenges to parts of the northeast of England, for example. So that's the result in from Cardiff West at 9:45. The First Minister re-elected. And Kirsty, I didn't think we'd quite get there to Cardiff West, but it's been good to see that, and that we can actually say that the Cardiff West result has been declared and the First Minister back in. And from our point of view, that kind of ties up the Welsh Labour story, doesn't it?
Well, it does, but we've also got the opportunity to speak to Lord Danny Finkelstein of The Times and Steve Richards, the author and broadcaster, on all these different elements. Let me first of all, good evening to both of you. Thank you for being with us at this time on a Friday night. Let's take you right back to the Hartlepool by-election this morning, Danny Finkelstein. And subsequently, the most rattled Keir Starmer I've ever seen in an interview today, clearly Labour is in a very big bind now about their future direction.
Absolutely. Look, I understand why he felt rattled, because when I sat here trying to think what I would advise him to do next if I was one of his team, it's very hard. In one way, he's suitable to a broader demographic that isn't Hartlepool. But then if he tries to go for that, can he win the next general election? Is Labour's Liberal base big enough? But he's not doing that well in going after those seats that he lost at the last general election. It is a dilemma, absolutely.
But it's interesting, Steve Richards, that Lord Adonis more or less said today that, you know, it was almost like we want a rerun, he said, of the, we didn't actually say these words, of the Blair playbook. But, you know, it is not the 90s. And it won't probably work now, because we have a particular set of previously Labour voters, who are families who are Labour voters, who are in their 30s, 40s and 50s, who don't want that anymore.
Andrew Adonis was half right. It is partly about leadership. And successful leaders in British politics are both actors and teachers. And I don't say that in a derogatory sense. It's not the only qualification of leadership, but it's an essential one. You have to communicate and explain and engage. And those who have had the ability to do that have been electorally successful. I agree with him about that. I don't agree with him if he's arguing that what's required is a return to the 1990s, or, I mean, Tony Blair was a product of a distinct period in British politics, very different from now. He is was a passionate Remainer. He was part of a sort of economic liberal consensus, as was Danny and George Osborne and David Cameron, which is miles away from the ideas whirling around British politics now: levelling up, build back better, connecting the left behind, all implying agency with the state in ways that haven't been part of British politics for a long time.
Danny Finkelstein, though, that you wrote a piece earlier in the week that there are structural problems if the Tories tie their policies in so closely to the red wall.
Well, it's a very good policy for now. You build a coalition that is stronger and wider than Labour's, but you do have a problem, I suppose, in the medium to longer term. The thing that Steve, I think, was missing in his analysis is the Conservative Party is very adaptable to circumstances, and I think it's always been its advantage over Labour. It doesn't mind changing its coalition, and it doesn't mind changing its position from its position in 2010 when it faced a deficit election, and that was a very advantageous position, to the position now after Brexit. It doesn't mind doing that, and therefore it can probably take what does look like a potent but reasonably short-term position, which is you go for older voters, less urban voters, you win seats in places you haven't won them before, but you do endanger in the longer term your younger support and your city support. And if the country becomes more urban and more diverse and over time more liberal, you may end up not, you know, your demographic may look short term, but the Conservative Party can adapt to that when that happens, I guess.
Steve, can I just jump in because I'm just interested in your perspective on this, having been reporting for so long on these changes. And, you know, are we at a period where a Prime Minister can face allegations of sleaze and that the ministers working with him can face allegations of, you know, giving contracts to friends and all the rest of it, and for that to have no electoral effect at all? Is that where we are?
It would seem so. That these elections suggest exactly that. That doesn't mean, as Danny Finkelstein has argued before, that at some point they don't become potent. But evidently that's not the case at the moment because of these results. And it's, again, a danger, really, to sort of misread the mid-1990s. Keir Starmer has been going on about Tory sleaze, as Tony Blair went on about Tory sleaze. But sleaze was only an element of the fall of the Tories in '97, and I don't think would have been particularly powerful on its own. So it's always combined with other factors, which might still come into play, but evidently haven't yet.
Just following on, Steve, as well, because earlier I was talking to Peter Kyle, who's the a Labour MP for Hove and the Shadow Justice Minister, and I was just struck by the nature of the language that he used in terms of the need for change in the party, very much picking up the theme that Keir Starmer gave us earlier. We need to realign our priorities, faster, deeper change. And then he said, this is going to happen in the next few weeks. Now, obviously, policy changes in a matter of weeks would be rather ambitious, I'd have thought. But so what kind of changes will we need then to see in Labour, to see that they've changed in a matter of weeks? What could they be talking about?
Well, it's a good question, and there are dangers in this of Keir Starmer in a panic rushing into statements that then fall apart in the months that come. That's happened before when leaders feel besieged and in difficulty. But it is a statement of the obvious that change is required. I don't think we've got time now to explore the nature of that change, but I will observe this, that of the endless stuff on Twitter from commentators, from Labour people, they all say the need to change, but are pretty vague and imprecise about how. I think it is within that agenda that is Boris Johnson's theoretical agenda, quite a lot of space for Labour. If the Tory government does it, back it, as Cameron sometimes cleverly backed Blair. But if they don't do the levelling up in a way that it implies, or they don't reconnect with the left behind, they don't build back better in a way that it implies, there is space there. But obviously there are 1,000 other things. But calls for change and calls for go back to the centre, do this, do that, are notoriously imprecise. And I think you're right to question whether weeks the nature of the change can be addressed. It's much deeper than that. But it is urgent, or else they're in deep, deep trouble. This might not be the worst of it.
Thanks, Steve.
Quick one for you, Steve, from me. I mean, you're the great chronicler of Prime Ministers. Has this been transformative for Boris Johnson himself, do you think? And does it allow him a place in the transformative Prime Ministers? Attlee, Blair, Thatcher. You know, in a way, has Boris Johnson kind of grown into this?
Well, he certainly will go down as one of the historic prime ministers, whatever happens, because of Brexit, which was very much him and delivered, and then followed with a big majority. This realignment, too, is an historic achievement on his part. There's no question. It doesn't happen very often that a party invades another party's traditional base in the way that he has managed to do. Now, there are big, big questions about whether he can deliver on his broader policy agenda, and questions about conduct and all kinds of other things. But he will be one of the historic prime ministers, whatever happens next.
Steve Richards, Danny Finkelstein, thank you for joining us.
I'm sorry we're out of time there. I was going to ask Danny another question, but apologies, Danny. We'll come back to you, hopefully. If you turn up tomorrow for our coverage then on the results coming into our afternoon, we'd be very happy to have you back. So let me bring in Sir John Curtis again. Because, John, we are just minutes away from the end of this broadcast, and our thanks to you and the team once again for providing us with your usual flawless and expert service. So where are we, John? I mean, just sum up where we are at the end of this very long day.
Well, we have a Conservative government that, for a party that's been in office for 18 months in this term and now been in office since 2010, that finds itself in a remarkably strong electoral position, clearly ahead in the English local elections outside of London. So certainly success for it. We've seen the Labour Party in Wales do certainly better than we were expecting, and probably in the end may well end up with 30 seats. And that may mean that they can, if the Liberal Democrats do pick up a list seat, that they'll be able to engineer a majority that way, or by persuading one of the opposition MSs to become presiding officer. So Labour may find itself not having to do a deal with Plaid, which is what was widely anticipated. Meanwhile, north of the border, the Conservatives, the SNP, do find themselves having to do a deal. They're going to have to come to some kind of understanding with the Greens, unless that very narrow pathway that does still exist towards an SNP majority were to actually transpire. But I think perhaps it's also just worth looking a little more closely at Scotland in particular, because in a sense, you know, irrespective of whether the SNP got an overall majority or not, the outcome does really clearly indicate that Scotland is now very, very much a divided country. It looks to us, probably when all the ballots have been counted, that probably about 49% of people have voted for one of the pro-independence parties on the constituency ballot and maybe around a half on the list vote. And that's basically what the opinion polls in Scotland are telling us is the division of opinion north of the border. Half want to leave the UK, half wish to stay. What's also clear about the constitutional question in Scotland is that it really matters to voters. Ironically, the Unionists spent most of this campaign trying to persuade voters that the constitutional question should not be on the agenda. Well, voters' reaction to what they found themselves in was to result in a much higher level of turnout, emulating in some ways or echoing the very high turnout we had in the 2014 independence referendum. This is a question that people think matters. And secondly, ironically, the Unionist parties have perhaps been able to deny the SNP an overall majority by persuading their own voters that the constitutional question matters and therefore voting tactically.
John, once again, our thanks, and we'll talk again tomorrow when we get more results in. But Sir John Curtis, thank you very much. Kirsty, I know you've still got some work to do tonight, which I have to say I don't envy you for. But just a final thought before we say goodnight.
Well, I think the final thought is that there's so much to unfold tomorrow in each of these different areas, in the local elections, in the mayor elections. Obviously, London's a big story, and in Scotland. But we'll have more tonight on Newsnight. Emily and I will be on BBC Two at 11:15, of course.
Thank you very much, and we'll look forward to Newsnight as well, Kirsty, I promise you. Rita, just a final thought from you, quickly.
Echoing Kirsty, really, we have started off with 7 sets of elections and we still have them ongoing. We don't have anything decided at all. So it's been a marathon today. It'll be another one tomorrow. Do join us.
Rita, thank you very much. From Kirsty and me as well, thank you for watching. It's been a long day, but we've had some pretty memorable events during that day. We'll be back tomorrow. Kirsty will be back on a little later. She deserves a medal. 1:15 tomorrow on BBC One and the News Channel, as we have more results coming in England, Scotland and Wales. And we'll see you then. So from Kirsty and from me, for now anyway, it's thanks for watching and good night.